很高兴大家到这一期不一样的思想先驱报与我见面啊！我坐在这个椅子上还是有一点不习惯的，因为平时不是老板，我坐那个椅子呀都是木椅子啊，很硬的这一种。何斌先生呢坐这个椅子显得舒服了很多。习近平和美国的商界领袖在吃饭的时候，何斌先生你有没有印象？桌上摆的是什么花儿？
我坦率的跟你说他的演讲我是晚上凌晨2点钟听了以后就睡着了，就再也没听过了。所以我更不是说看了画面都没看到。
对，您老人家是不看画面啊，但人家摆的是叫做玫瑰花和兰花。
对，你在节目里面讲过，
有寓意啊。我们节目里面也讲过，可见您节目的时候也没有集中注意力听啊。我们旁边摆的是一桩雄壮的狗尾巴草啊，不知道是什么样的意涵。思想先驱报，我们换这样的一种录制形式，好不好？还是在演播室里更符合您的品味？需要各位观众朋友们告诉我们您的看法。我们呢是为观众是上帝，观众怎么说我们就怎么决定。当然有的时候上帝不止一个，所以我们对于上帝的意见也是要有这个择选的接受啊。今天呢，我们在思想先驱报这个环节中为大家着重介绍的是王向伟先生在南华早报的一篇文章啊。王向伟先生曾经担任南华早报的主编，后来呢是南华早报的专栏作家，现在呢是已经在香港浸会大学做教授啊，讲授新闻传播学。但是呢，王向伟教授仍然经常有关于中美关系、中国经济中国时政的一些精彩的评论。这一天的文章王向伟先生就提出了一个概念，就是中美之间有这样一个短暂的不可多得的机遇窗口期，习近平应该抓住这个窗口期的机会。而王向伟先生认为呢，之前中国是在过分强调对美斗争的安全问题上走得太远，现在既然中国和美国之间已经寻得了难得的关系的缓和，那么下一步习近平就应该把更多的精力集中到国内经济上，这是王向伟先生的主要观点啊。但是在谈到中美之间这个短暂窗口期的时候，王向伟先生呢是举出了几个例子。这一篇文章的完整版我们现在就请导播插入，先让我们观众朋友们了解一下这一篇文章到底讲了什么内容。
王向伟，南华早报观点：在旧金山举行的4小时峰会之前，中美关系已跌至40年来的最低点。除了承诺继续会谈之外，会谈没有取得太多进展，但这足以让世界其他国家集体松一口气。这次峰会的意义不应被低估，尤其是因为在这次会议之前，特别是在今年2月美国击落了一个中国间谍气球之后，世界上最重要的双边关系的发展轨迹一直被阴霾和厄运所笼罩。拜登称，此次会谈是我们进行的最具建设性和最有成效的讨论。中方则更为乐观，称赞此次峰会具有战略意义和深远影响，并赞扬习近平在指导大国关系方面的远见和智慧。但重启能持续多久？由于中美关系背后的系统性分歧仍未解决，人们有理由怀疑。例如，拜登强调两国应负责任地处理竞争关系，防止其陷入冲突，而习近平则大声问道：我们是对手还是伙伴？很少有人会期望中美两国的外交回到20-30年前的水平，但在双边关系的关键时刻，如何处理对手与伙伴的问题，向老一辈中美领导人学习，对今天很有意义。1969年，中国与苏联发生边界冲突后，毛泽东决定转向美国。1970年，他邀请美国记者埃德加·斯诺 （Edgar Snow） 夫妇在天安门城楼上参加国庆庆典。时任美国总统的理查德·尼克松 （Richard Nixon） 对这一信号反应良好，并因此于1972年访华。1979年，中美全面恢复外交关系。1989年，北京血腥镇压天安门抗议活动后，国际舆论转而反对中国。邓小平秘密会见了乔治 ·H.W. 布什总统的国家安全顾问布伦特·斯考克罗夫特，强调必须改善中美关系。江泽民在位时，曾在不到3年的时间里与2位美国总统周旋，面临2个可能导致中美关系走向反面的关键时刻。1999年，美国误炸中国驻贝尔格莱德大使馆，造成3名中国记者死亡，激怒了中国公众。 2001年，一架美国侦察机与一架中国战斗机在空中相撞，引发了两国之间的重大争端。江泽民以灵巧的身手和战略耐心处理了这两起事件，使双边关系重回正轨，并确保了美国对中国加入世界贸易组织的支持，这为中国随后20年的经济繁荣铺平了道路。现在，双边关系再次处于十字路口。习近平可能已经放弃了邓小平长期以来保持低调、等待时机的口号，但他显然知道稳定中美关系事关重大。在旧金山的魅力攻势中，习近平对拜登说：“地球足够大，两国可以成功。”他还向美国商界领袖保证，下一个中国仍然是中国，因为世界上最大的两个经济体深深地交织在一起。不过，怀疑论者可能会说，在习近平的领导下，中国已经发生了翻天覆地的变化，很难再回到过去的美好时光。中美两国的经济总量约占世界经济总量的1/3，人口约占全球总人口的1/4，贸易额约占全球贸易总额的1/5。如果北京和华盛顿能够找到确保持久共存的方法，那将是世界和平与发展的最佳稳定力量。自2018年唐纳德·特朗普发起对华贸易战以来，北京指责华盛顿试图通过其联盟网络打压中国，因此将重心转向安全而非发展。虽然中国有充分的理由将安全放在首位，但它在牺牲经济方面走得太远了。加上政策失误和严厉的零成本管制，中国经济在增长缓慢、地方政府债务、房地产市场下滑和外资大幅撤离等日益严重的问题中步履蹒跚。20世纪70年代末，邓小平结束了毛泽东以阶级斗争为纲的极左政策，主张把经济建设作为改革开放的中心任务。这一口号意味着所有政策的制定都必须支持各行各业的经济发展，从而确保了中国经济在过去40年的强劲增长。然而，在过去的5年里，安全问题已成为重中之重。去年，习近平在中国共产党第20次全国代表大会上发表重要讲话时，曾一度提到发展是政府的中心任务，但在国家安全和社会稳定方面却花了更多时间，强调政治安全是根本任务，经济安全是基础，军事、科技、文化、社会安全是重要支柱，国际安全是支撑。但实际上，恢复经济活力和国内外企业的信心是中国领导层面临的更大挑战，尤其是因为习近平在清除了所有其他政治派别之后，进一步巩固了他作为中国几十年来最有权力的领导人的地位。现在，中美两国正走向一段令人不安的平静期，中国领导层必须利用这一机会之窗，在安全与发展之间找到更好的平衡。这就要求我们重新努力，真正将发展作为政府的中心任务。
刚才我们听到啊，在这一篇文章中，王向伟先生谈到，在1969年的时候，当时呢，苏联与中国发生了边界冲突。这样的一次边界冲突啊，反而是给了毛泽东一个缓和和美国关系的窗口期。那比如说在之后的1970年，我们看到啊，美国的这个记者啊，斯诺夫妇在天安门城楼上参加了国庆典礼。而之后呢，美国的时任总统尼克松还有呢基辛格啊，对于这样的信号反应非常的良好，认为从中国这一边看到了某一种示好的方向。72年访华，79年与中国全面恢复了外交关系。因此从这个角度来看，毛泽东是抓住了与苏联交恶这个窗口期。89年北京镇压了天安门广场的抗议，当时啊整个国际舆论完全是反对中国，国际气氛非常的紧张。而何明先生你在节目中也讲到，当时邓小平是秘密会见了乔治·布什总统的国家安全顾问斯考克罗夫特。那么当时呢，强调改善中美关系的重要性，也是抓住了这样一个难得的契机。中美关系看似无望的时候，又出现了一丝生机。而江泽民时代呢，与中美关系其实也有几次危机的阶段 首先呢是贝尔格莱德使馆被撞击事件，造成3位中国记者的死亡。之后呢又是南海撞击事件，都引发了中美之间的可以说是外交冲突的升级。但是江泽民随后呢也是以灵活的身段，比较巧妙地处理了这2件事情。而随后呢美国呢是支持中国加入世贸组织，可以说是为中国经济的平稳发展赢得了广泛的时间。抓住机遇非常的重要。那我想先请问何明先生这一次习近平访美进行了那个您一听就睡着了，但是商界据说反应非常良好的34分钟的演讲，算不算是习近平这一次访美的重要成就之一，为中国争得了一个机遇窗口期？第二，您同不同意王向伟先生所说的，在这个窗口期，中国应该淡化安全，更多的把重心发展到国内经济上来？这2方面怎么看？
习近平这一次到美国的访问可以说是相当的成功，而且在之前我在华尔街论坛已经就是挑战所有的这些唱衰的媒体，西方媒体认为没什么成就，我认为完全不可能的，是因为2国元首在现在这种艰难的情况之下见面，本身就是一大突破。这个方面的主要的功劳，我认为是在拜登总统，但是习近平配合的很不错。习近平这一次赢得了美国商界的一个好感，居然发现中国人也是可以讲人话，居然也是有思想，也是有情感的人，可以说非常的成功。但是中美关系的这样一个机会场就是我们知道王向伟先生是非常有动静。不但有动静，我觉得他是一个非常尊重基本上事实的一个观察家。我们知道现在的读者、现在的观众就比较喜欢听这种非常极端的理论无论是在西方还是在中国都是差不多。这个时候要能够保持一等平时的尊重事实的态度，同时还要提供一些见解，这是王向伟先生是其中我在尊重他的很重要的原因之一。那么我觉得中美关系为什么会有机会窗，和为什么未来还有麻烦，为什么大家并不是说这一次中美关系从此就和好了，原因就是2点。第一点，中美之间我们不能叫它竞争关系也好，伙伴关系也好，合作关系也好，新时代关系也好，2个国家的政治制度，2个国家的利益关系，2个国家的历史的传统是不同同时又是呢巨型大国，这种大国就决定了这2个关系呢，它会不断的产生矛盾，不断的产生冲突，所以这个你可以说是一个结构性的问题。第二个是大国，我们经常有一种说法这是中国人最喜欢说大国。大国有另外一种说法是拿不出台面，但是基本上是一个的事实，就是小国无外交大国有工具，它的这个工具非常之多，你不知道哪个天他就拿一个你根本不知道的工具出来，而这个工具的作用又非常非常之大，所以不要轻而易举这个轻视说这个大国就一定往这个方向走了。也许有一天他这个领导人完全做出来的一个动作是不同像你刚才讲的王向伟先生里面讲的当年的毛泽东对吧，在跟苏联交恶文化大革命，然后一定要打倒或者是消灭，或者是什么美国什么什么资本主义反美反帝这些宣传口号，突然对吧，让一个美国人上了天安门城楼，当时站在天安门城楼的陪在旁边的人就是我的一位好朋友很遗憾他去世了就是纪晓岚先生他在生前跟我聊过很多这样的事情，那他就在旁边那个时候就是发出一个信号，就是说我们要开放了。正是因为这些信号，后来就引起一系列的连锁反应，什么乒乓球外交什么基辛格和尼克森的突破的访问所以我们看待中国和看待美国的时候，不要简单的下一个结论说一定是这样，它是有很多变的这个机会。那么这2个因素加在一起，我们就可以大概确定一下中美关系的未来。就是第一， 这两个国家很多事情它必须在一起合作啊，这就是为什么拜登总统和习近平主席他们有这么一个交谈，因为有些事情不合作是根本不可能的，比如说芬太尼的事情，比如说亚洲的这样一个南海的问题，比如说台湾关系的问题，比如说中美之间的贸易合作的问题，还有气候问题，就是有无数的问题，没有美国不行，没有中国也不行，所以他们制定了他们必须有一些合作。但是另一方面呢，这两个国家又有一些很大的差别，甚至有一些竞争啊，或者是对立的关系，又使这个事情呢就不断的会产生反复。所以呢，你可以说不断的有大事情发生，但是你不要认为大事情发生就一定是什么事情呢不会合作，但是合作的时候你不要以为日子会一直很好，他会这个反反复复。老是有人说啊，这个谁谁谁把中美关系搞僵了。你刚才在前面讲了，当年还发生了南海的撞击事件，当年还发生中国大使馆被攻击的事件，对吧？死了人了，这都是，对吧？到现在为止，至少还没有什么发生很大的这个冲突吧。所以对中美关系，我们要用一个比较冷静的一个看法出来。那当然，这个王向伟先生这次提了个建议，现在要利用现在暂时的这个机会的窗口期，把一些中美关系给做好。那我觉得中国方面已经做出了一些举动，但是还是不够啊。比如说啊，给这个美国人啊，拿美国护照的人啊，到中国去的这个陆地签证的时间好像是6天，而且地方也扩大了很多。但是这个远远不够的，邀请这个美国的年轻人去中国，这都是一些好的动作，但是这个动作还是差得很远。美国也一样，美国的问题就是它不像中国，中国就是习近平主席说了算，美国就是总统他想这样做，在现实中间也比较难。但是不管怎么样，就是说对中美关系用不着看得那么单一的一个结论。
好，谢谢何明先生的介绍。那么有关于王向伟先生的这一篇文章，刚才我们观众是已经听了全文，也听了和平先生的解读。您是不是同意王向伟先生在文章中所说的：第一，中国有这样的一个机遇窗口期；第二，这样的一个机遇窗口期应该利用好。刚才和平先生点评，现在的一些动作还远远不够呢，也请您在节目的留言区告诉我们。今天的思想先驱报这个环节就为大家讨论到这里。在上期的思想先驱报中我们为大家介绍了王向伟先生在南华早报的一篇评论文章，其中特别讲到了习近平访问旧金山，加入 APEC 峰会，并且与拜登总统进行元首峰会，为中美关系赢得了一个难得的窗口期。今天我们着重为大家介绍是另外一位我们非常尊敬的中国时政问题观察者裴敏欣教授。裴敏欣教授在彭博社也发表了一篇文章但这篇观点文章呢，可以说是提出了一个相呼应或者是相补充的话题，就是中国搞好和美国的关系固然重要，但是和美国的关系再好也好不到哪里去。习近平求爱的对象错了，你与其去和美国搞好关系，更重要的是解决身边的和近邻之间的摩擦。近邻包括哪一些呢？比如日本，比如韩国，比如菲律宾等等等等。我们先说中美关系中美关系的重要性，我们在节目里面是反复强调过。习近平跟纽森见面的时候也提过一组数字，叫做2345。什么意思呢？中美是世界2大经济体，中美的经济总量是占到世界经济总量的1/3，两国的人口是占到全球总人口的1/4，贸易总额是占到全世界贸易总额的1/5。中美之间的关系是十分重要的，但是中美之间关系固然重要，也正由于两国之间这种相爱相杀的竞争关系，似乎注定了两国之间的关系不可能在一次会面之后取得根本的改进。和平先生有一个词叫做打打停停，而用裴敏欣先生的话说，就是好也好不到哪里去坏也不会脱钩脱轨的太远了。这呢，可能是裴敏欣教授在这一篇文章中的一个立论起点。但是反观中国周边的这一些小国，可以说 从中国的角度而言，对于他们可以使用的工具，往往是十分的严厉，而且呢，说的难听一点，就是经常让人是没有还手之力的。比如强大的贸易工具，比如强大的这个制裁工具，包括对于个别企业和商业行业的惩罚。之前我们有韩国的萨德事件，日本近期是福岛废水事件，和菲律宾是南海的军事争议等等等等。现在呀，这一些周边的小国似乎出现了这样的一种倾向，旁边的这个巨邻也让人感觉到在一些行为上过于的，我们叫做咄咄逼人啊，是一个不太容易相处的邻居。但是这个邻居又这么强大，怎么办呢？我们呢就靠向美国。而在裴敏欣教授看来，这对于中国的发展，对于中国稳定国际关系是十分不利的。因此，一方面需要和美国搞好关系，一方面也需要解决和近邻之间的矛盾。那么在请何明先生谈他的观点之前啊，我们首先完整的听完裴敏欣教授的这一篇彭博社的观点文章到底讲了哪一些内容。
裴敏欣，彭博观点：习近平在错误的地方寻找朋友。与其与美国谈情说爱，中国领导人不如与近邻修好关系。中国国家主席习近平上周与美国总统拜登举行的峰会至少实现了2个目标。会谈暂时稳定了习近平所说的世界上最重要的双边关系。而且，从官方媒体的热烈报道来看，会谈还提升了习近平在中国人民心目中的世界领袖形象。然而，如果习近平真的想改善中国的地缘政治地位，他就应该开始讨好离家更近的领导人。习近平与拜登的会晤是否为中美关系铺平了道路，这仍是一个悬而未决的问题。此次峰会的实质性成果，恢复军方之间的沟通，以及中方承诺打击用于制造芬太尼的潜体化学品出口，代表着中美关系朝着稳定被多年来不断升级的紧张局势所破坏的关系迈出了积极但微小的一步。美国总统大选投票在即，很难取得进一步进展。美国两党的反华情绪广泛存在，而且可能根深蒂固。最令中国担忧的是，美国共和党的主要总统候选人一直在激烈争当最强硬的对华鹰派，将中国称为敌人，并誓言采取更激进的措施遏制中国的力量。鉴于拜登在政治上的弱势地位，他不太可能冒更大风险修补与中国的关系。习近平最希望的是当前的解冻能尽可能长久地持续下去。然而，这次峰会为中国改善与邻国的关系打开了一扇机会之窗。在美国寻求与其最大竞争对手缓和关系的背景下，许多亚洲国家如果能接受中国的姿态，就不会那么担心美国的负面反应。如果中国能迅速与这些国家建立联系，将对自己大有裨益。与美国不同，中国的邻国都没有陷入修昔底德陷阱，与中国争夺全球霸主地位。双边紧张局势的根源，海洋、领土边界和贸易争端是可以通过谈判和让步来解决的。地理因素也决定了这些国家对与中国和平共处有着持久的兴趣。作为这些国家最大的贸易伙伴，中国拥有巨大的经济影响力，只要这种影响力不被滥用。虽然对中国有利的力量对比会让邻国产生生存恐惧，但刻意的克制可以缓解这种恐惧。也许最重要的是，中国会得到实惠，改善两国关系所需的善意姿态和让步成本低廉，而且可行。碰撞2020年初，澳大利亚要求对 COVID-19 大流行病的起源展开国际调查，从而激怒了中国政府。中国只需释放1名被冤枉入狱的澳大利亚记者，并取消几项贸易制裁，就能将两国关系恢复到合理水平。所付出的代价几乎微不足道，尽管中国通过骚扰澳大利亚海军潜水员和维持其他惩罚性贸易措施削弱了自己的地位。在接下来的几个月里，中国应该运用同样的模式来争取其他邻国。日本最近引起了中国的愤怒，因为东京在台湾问题上向华盛顿靠拢。过去的欺凌策略只是疏远了日本，却没有改变其政策。 习近平上周会见了日本首相岸田文雄，迈出了第一步。日本希望解决的当务之急，结束中国以所谓的安全问题为由，禁止日本进口海鲜的禁令，以及释放因涉嫌间谍罪而被中国拘留的日本国民，并不需要习近平花费太多的政治资本，尤其是与潜在的外交回报相比。改善与邻国的关系也将有助于中国与美国的关系。中国与美国在亚洲的条约盟国日本、菲律宾和韩国之间的安全争端，无形中加剧了北京与华盛顿之间的紧张关系。因为美国受法律义务和地缘政治利益的约束，必须向这些国家提供援助。因此，缓和中国在南海对菲律宾以及在尖阁斜杠钓鱼岛争议海域对日本的恐吓，可以同时实现两个有价值的目标：改善与邻国的关系，避免与美国发生冲突。中国领导人可能仍然受到远交近攻思想的影响。这一古代地缘政治智慧建议与远方国家发展关系，但与邻国保持高度紧张。在前苏联代表着生存军事威胁的冷战时期，远交近攻显然是有道理的。但现在，中国正与一个遥远的全球霸主展开无休止的较量。与邻国友好相处应该是战略需要，也是理所当然的。
好，刚才我们是听完了裴敏欣教授在彭博观点版面所发表的这一篇文章，题目十分的有意思。习近平找朋友找错了地方，与其和美国谈情说爱，不如是修好与近邻的关系。我们就说如果我们说中国古代的谚语你经常能够相反的这个说法找到谚语都能找到。我们既说叫远亲不如近邻，强调邻居最重要，但是呢，在这个军事战略上还有叫远交近攻这个打人要打近处的人，交好要交远处的人。反正中国这个古老的智慧是你哪两方面都能够说通。那裴敏欣先生提到的这个看法，说尽管和拜登的这一次会谈一方面呢是提升了习近平的个人形象，另外呢从这个中国官方媒体的报道来看从这个国际舆论的反应来看，的确是为中国的地缘政治地位似乎是打开了一定的空间。但是中国和眼下的这一些近邻的关系仍然是悬而未决。中美关系可能出现积极的态势变化，但是马上美国大选要到了，拜登总统也面临美国国内鹰派对于他与中国交好的质疑，更不要说加州州长纽森先生到中国一行是受到了各方的批评。总而言之，从政治现实，从两国之间的关系本身而言，中美之间很难取得根本性的关系的转折。因此呢，习近平这一行固然是取得了成就，始终不会奠定中美关系相处的真正的方向性的变化，根本性的变化需要从近邻四周去找。那我们说这个裴敏欣先生的这一篇文章也呼应了何斌先生之前你在节目中所谈到的一些看法，特别是之前我们在节目中为观众朋友们介绍，现在呢中国、日本和韩国三国的元首峰会在即，似乎呢中国也可以利用这样一个机会，搞好和周边几个对于中国怀有很大警惕的邻居的关系。近日中国和菲律宾在南海可以说是交锋不断，美国再次强调了对于菲律宾的防务保证和承诺，似乎让菲律宾这个国家在中国和美国之间也在美国这一边的安全伞的庇护下，显得活得更加的安全和自如。习近平接下来应该怎样处理和这一些邻居的关系？
裴敏欣教授是这个几十年以来我一直伴奏他的这个大作。我们知道从学术的角度来讲，人到了一定年龄呢，很难免可以承载于自己的思维框架，承载于自己的这个已有的这种成果，很难有新的思想奉献出来。人真的是我现在每一天就让自己学习一些自己完全不懂的东西，就是因为想刺激一下自己的大脑。千万要知道，这个外部世界有很多事情是自己并不懂的。我不知道裴敏欣教授他是怎么训练自己的这个思维，因为我认识的很多的这个教授慢慢就已经开始固化了他的这个成就。而裴敏欣教授他总是会提出一些观点，你会感觉到 这不是一个教授啊，这是一个新闻人的敏锐和新闻人的一种观察啊，就是很有提示性。所以为什么彭博通讯社请他来写这样的文章，我估计是很有这个道理的，所以他很有动静。那么之所以很有动静啊，你就开始讲这个远交近攻啊。我是写文章呢，就是学问比较浅嘛，就基本上不太用成语，也不太用典故，还有一个心理上的暗示。我觉得古代的典故啊，就是一个神话，是一个传说啊。无论是远邻不如近亲，现在你的这个远亲也没有那么远啊，近亲呢住在你隔壁，你也未必跟他有什么交道。那个时候的古代的远交和近攻，如果是在中国的话，它远也远不出湖北或者是河南，这是都是非常近的，跟今天这样一个全球的一种国际关系是完全不能比的。那个时候的日本就已经很远了，所以我就讲这个借用古代的话来为今天的政治思想或者政治政策来做一个比喻，往往是一个比较懒惰的行为。当然啊，裴敏欣先生他不是这个意思，他恰恰是认为这种东西是错的啊，恰恰是错的。那跟美国搞好关系当然是没有问题，但是中国的问题是，在中国的传统来讲啊，中国叫这个名字叫中国，对吧？实际上有中央大国的味道。他在周围的国家呢，只要你啊不怎么样啊，你给我送你的东西来，我还反过来成倍的返你的礼物啊。它跟周边的关系讲老实话，中国是跟欧洲国家的相比，对的邻居是非常不错的。侵略了2个国家，一个是朝鲜，一个是越南，也不像西方的列强殖民者那么啊，这个掠夺别人的财富，掠夺别人的这个资源，相对来讲，中国没有那么的霸道，相比这个欧洲国家来讲啊。但是中国最近这些年出了一些问题，这些问题就是经济的高速发展，整个中国人一下子有一点膨胀的感觉。膨胀的感觉其中就是对邻居的态度，我是亲眼所见了，就是一般老百姓的这种感受。中国有2种老百姓啊，就是说一种老百姓就是认为中国已经牛得不得了了啊，到欧洲你这边都是小地方啊，到这个曼谷或者到台北，这都是中国的3、4线城市，非常的傲慢。这种傲慢是中国人的一部分心理，另一部分心理是比较天真的，认为美国什么都好，欧洲什么都好，中国什么都是糟糕的啊，等等等等。那么前面一种呢，实际上也投射到了这个中国领导人身上，也投射到了中国的外交，所谓的战狼外交啊，集中啊，大家可能平常没有看到的是对东南亚国家，对越南，对韩国，对这个日本啊，对菲律宾啊，真是有一点居高临下的感觉，觉得你们就是小国。我相信，如果你是一个东南亚的一个国民，你会在心里面不舒服的，对吧？那么其他的官员他也是一样的，他会投射到这个上面来。那这个李光耀先生是中国人很尊敬的一位政治家。那么这个政治家啊，我们今天讲了是小国无外交，但是我觉得他是特例，他是做出了一个，就是说可以说是不能说放之四海而皆准嘛，但是至少给了小国一个非常大的一个指引，怎么做好自己的平衡关系。他在东南亚的这个平衡的战术里面就讲到了，我们呢经济上我们要靠中国，但是安全上要靠美国。为什么李光耀先生这么讲呢？并不是说你中国还会侵略这些土地，而是中国这种居高临下、这种傲慢、这种霸道，让这些国家缺乏这个安全感。那为什么美国能够成功的拉拢这个南韩，能够成功的拉拢这个日本，固然跟这些领导人的这个有一些关系，但是很重要的一个原因就是中国大陆的军力发展没有跟这些邻居讲清楚。我们为什么发展这个军力？我的军队的透明度不高。那么在南海、在台海的这个政策方面，没有很好的跟周围的国家进行沟通啊。所以裴明先生讲的很对，就是说你把自己的周围的人推到了美国那一边，你强化了美国的力量，你天天跟美国就搞好关系，你把自己的近邻都弄不好。那么在目前看，我觉得中国政府 就是按照裴敏欣先生这个思路有一点差不多。你看看现在的美国那么拉拢这个周边的国家，但是中国现在除了对菲律宾还没有完全理清楚以外，我觉得下一步有可能会继续理清楚。但是对日本、对韩国开始出现了一个很大的一个改变，就是中日韩的外长很有可能为下一步的这块的话，明年年初吧也可能会晚一点那么就会进行这个三国的峰会。我认为这是一个非常好的机会应该的就是说，这一次至少没有轻而易举说我全部对你韩国怎么样，我全部对你日本怎么样。当然，对日本的这个还废水的问题，我觉得西方或者是中国一些媒体又把它简化了，因为对这个废水的这个担忧不仅是在中国。在台湾，在其他国家其实都是存在的，所以说中国就是分不清楚民间和官方混在一起，在造成了这种误解。我觉得现在对日本已经不像早几年那样，动不动就要去欺负日本。我如果这样的话，改变态度，增加自己的政治和军事透明度我觉得对于日本和韩国来讲，太不想跟中国作对。
好，谢谢贺明先生的点评那么在这一篇文章中裴敏欣教授还提出了一个观点或者是一个想法，就是中国呢在改善和邻国四邻之间的关系，其实呢有一个成功的典范，就是和澳大利亚之间的关系。那我们记得在莫里森政府时期中国和澳大利亚的关系可以说是非常的紧张，而中国呢对于澳大利亚有一系列的我们叫做惩罚性的贸易工具不管是你澳大利亚的葡萄酒，还是澳大利亚的煤炭，还是澳大利亚的龙虾这对于中国来说呢就是提高一下关税。但是中国作为澳大利亚这一些出口商的重要的市场，可是说让澳大利亚的农民和渔民是受尽了苦头。还有呢就是前央视记者程蕾女士在中国呢是被关押了3年之多，也成了中国和澳大利亚之间外交之间的一个重要的交锋的要点。但是就在最近的几个月，裴敏欣教授评论到，对于中国而言，你取消对于澳大利亚的一些惩罚性的关税，既不消耗经济成本，对于习近平来说，政治代价也是非常的小的。一个央视的一个记者你让他遵守合理的外交的礼仪和规范允许他的领事探测权把他的案件呢按照规矩来处理，也是对于中国来说是轻而易举的事情。但是对于澳大利亚来说呢，就是解决了一个重要的问题。因此中国我们叫做缓和和四邻的关系，说艰难也艰难。和澳大利亚如此恶劣的关系，都在几个月之间出现了180度的转弯。和韩国和日本，包括和菲律宾也是如此。对于习近平本人来说要花费的政治和经济成本并没有那么大，但是改善这一些邻里关系，对于习近平的叫改善与中国和四边的这样的一个外部环境来说，可以说是意义十分深远的。因此这是一笔合算的买卖，不但应该做，而且也值得做这样的一个篇文章可以说是提出了一个相当有趣的观点。平时我们关注国际关系，经常是关注中欧关系、中美关系，关注中国和大的地缘政治集团的关系。但实际上呢，了解到中国和周边关系的历史也是十分关键并且有趣的。在今天呢，我们特别为大家带来彭博观点版裴敏欣教授的文章，希望对您有帮助。我们有一个节目叫做华尔街智库经常为大家介绍美国的、世界的各大智库对于中国经济环境的分析，对于习近平经济政策的点评等等等等。那么在刚刚过去的这个周末我就特别注意到，在德国的莫卡托研究所专门研究中国时政的研究部门发表了一篇中国经济报告。这个报告有一个很有意思的题目，叫做 Party Knows Best。 什么意思呢？就是说说懂还是党最懂。当然这个题目是有一点讽刺的意味，它实际讲的是什么呢？讲的是在习近平治下中国管理经济思路的变化。那么整篇报告有100多页非常的详尽，可以说是概述了习近平治下对于中国经济政策的方方面面，并且呢对于这一些政策的利弊和可能导致的后果都进行了深入的点评。我们在华尔街智库这一档栏目也会为大家完整的带来这一篇报告的完整内容。那么今天呢，我就节选这一些报告中我觉得比较可圈可点的一些观点和发现，请何明先生简单做点评。平时我们在评点习近平的经济政策的时候经常会听到几个词，第一个叫做国进民退似乎呢是在习近平的治下 对于国家、国有企业、对于党角色进行了更多的强调，而对于私营企业的作用，对于私营企业家创新的作用，似乎不那么重视了。甚至之前几年的监管打压，还引发了很多民营经济是不是要退场这样的说辞和争议。但是根据莫卡托研究所的这样的一篇报告实际上呢，我们可能对于这个问题的定性并不准确。他们认为在习近平之前的这一些领导人，特别是胡温江时代的这一些领导人他们的政治经济学是经济效率为优先，发展只要快，什么都是其次次要的。而在这呢，也是符合中国经济的优先事项的。在习近平时代的政治经济学，更多的是从单纯的发展目标，或者我们叫做经济的增速目标，转移到了地缘政治的综合目标，要考虑到中国的新的发展阶段和现实，中国所面临的国际形势和国际环境的不同，以及现在习近平所拥有的政治资源，给了他这样的政治资本，就是你可以跨越眼前的短期的问题，来想到什么样的转型策略，什么样在短期需要带来痛苦的战略，可能对于中国的长久健康发展更为有利。因此这一篇文章首先提出了一个观点，就是习近平重新调整了中国的政治经济学，首要的目标不是中国经济的增速要变得更快，也不是中国经济的效率要必须提得更高，而是中国在地缘政治充满挑战的环境中要追求一种韧性。这个韧性既是安全性，同时也是发展的韧性。那么为了实现这样的一个愿景，习近平到底有哪一些优先事项和策略呢？这就是这一篇报告所探索的焦点。那么其实说到具体的策略我们之前在节目中已经反复强调了。首先优先事项之一就是要保护中国的某一种独立性，即使是面对供应链的切割，即使是面对更加复杂的地缘政治环境，中国的发展之路不会被外部的手掐死。所谓的技术自力更生、供应链自主实现以及境内价值链的安全等。换句话说，任何一个国家都没有办法通过单一的资源手段、技术手段、资本手段、市场手段来切割或者是压制中国的市场。这个呢是习近平时代的第一个我们叫做优先事项和目标。第二个优先事项和目标是什么呢？用这个研究所的话说叫做重塑中国的经济联系。就是在中国没有办法实现本地供应的情况下，由于资源所限等等等等，由于发展的能力所限、阶段所限等等等等，在美国、加拿大、澳大利亚、韩国、日本等在石油、天然气、大豆、铁矿石重要原材料在这一些地方要实现全球范围内的中国的稳定的国际经济关系。供应商的多元化、供应链的多元化、供应结构的整体化和牢固化，也是习近平的一个优先事项。这可能就是为什么我们经常听到习近平自诩是发展中世界的领导者，或者是与发展中国家搞好关系。因为我们刚才提到的，不管是铁矿资源大宗商品资源、能源、食物等等等等，对于中国来说，很多的重要的进口伙伴和贸易商是来自发展中国家，比如中东，比如亚洲的其他国家，比如非洲等等等等。因此，重塑中国的全球经济关系，在发达国家之外建立中国的经济安全外部网，这是习近平的第二个优先事项。而第三个优先事项是什么呢？用书中说叫维护中国的社会基础。社会基础，那么近期我们经常想到的一个词叫做共同富裕。那么这个社会基础呢，其实不仅仅是我们说在分配上要更多的考虑到中国的中产阶级和中国现在还没有脱贫的6亿人的福利问题，包括房地产的风险，包括去杠杆化，都不是把增长放在首位，而是为中国的某一种我们叫做社会发展的平衡性做准备。第一是考虑到大多数人的利益，第二是发展要更加的我们叫做可持续这样的一条路线。尽管习近平本人是经常说要呼吁把家庭消费放在首位，提高家庭消费，但是目前来看，中国的整个的分配结构还是十分不均匀的。那我想先请问何密先生，这篇报告首先提出了一个观点，认为习近平时代的经济发展的优先事项和之前已经出现了根本性的差别，而同时提出了3个经济发展优先目标。第一，我们叫做 外部经济安全，或者叫做技术独立技术自主。第二呢，叫做全球经济关系的重塑，强调的是进口的多元性、依赖的多元性，整个网络要更加安全。第三点强调的是社会经济基础，社会要更加平衡，房地产的价格不能够无限期的上涨，债务问题不能够继续恶化。您认为莫卡图研究所对于中国经济优先事项的点评是不是正确？
我们知道每一天呢，现在我们有了六度简报之后你那种阅读西方的这种智库报告和媒体评论那个速度大大就加快了。那么这个看多了以后，你就会感觉到有点失望大部分的观点都是人云亦云比较多，即使是在智库和这些聪明的评论里面呢，还是差不多。但是你刚才讲的这篇评论这篇这个智库报告我觉得听起来是很有洞察力，很有洞察力。因为你现在在中国大陆聚会也好，包括在海外聚会也好，基本上听到的都是怨恨就是好像不把习近平骂成一个傻子，或者是蠢货，或者是把好的机会的断送了，好像你就不是个正常的人你好像就是要拿了习近平的钱，或者是要跟习近平擦鞋，或者是怎么样。就中国基本上已经丧失了正常讨论今天问题的这个能力，而这个能力在中国大陆是这样，在海外也是这样，它成为了一种传染病传染病。但是在这个时候还有这样的文章比较严肃的讨论中国共产党为什么这么干，习近平为什么这么干所以我很佩服这样的一个智库报告，也感谢李吉博士我们的思想先驱报总是有这样的一些见解，这些见解对不对我们都是可以讨论的，但是你至少有一个讨论的基础。现在在中国和海外其实讨论的基础已经非常的单薄。为什么会出现这种单薄？是因为中国发展到了一定阶段之后，继续像胡锦涛和温家宝的好奇那样放水，让大家继续感觉到还原，还是说呢要收紧，要调整。中国的现代化的发展有它的天生的缺点，也有它天然的一些优良的条件。天生的缺点是中国的这个体制，中国的文化的传统对现代化的影响。但是有一个天然的一个好处呢，还不是中国天生的条件，是全世界各个国家的发展之路给了中国一些什么样的一些启示。为什么南美那样一个民主的体制、法治的体制、宗教的传统几乎所有的构成中国人想象的现代化的必要条件，在南美其实都具备。但是为什么南美变成南美陷阱，变成一下子极左，一下子极右？为什么日本这样一个这个亚洲的文明的国家，最开始的民主化，最开始的这个科学进步引入亚洲，包括中国的现代化的革命，现代的革命都跟日本是最密切相关的。为什么它在经过了一个高速经济的增长之后，就一时失落下去，失落10年，失落20年，失落30年，甚至失落40年？为什么苏联东奥崩溃之后，并没有出现大家期待的那样，有了一个民主，就比原来的共产党的统治会好很多当然在很多方面自由是好了很多。为什么经济时政，无论是正当的疗法还是其他的做法都没有起来？还有这个颜色革命在阿拉伯世界现在已经都不好意思谈了。那么这些事情给了中国的发展之路的人的一点警惕。一方面他们是为了自己的统治不能丢掉江山，另一方面他们从经济来讲去寻找中国的发展道路。所以我跟这个几乎绝大多数的朋友有一点分歧，就是我认为习近平的上台几乎是中国政治经济发展到一定阶段的一个必然反应。习近平的集权指挥就像重新想走苏联东奥道路，重新想走南美的道路，否则的话他进行集权，进行他的一个政策战略的根本调整是成为一个必然。如果你没有这样一种基本的认知，你今天就会对 啊，中央电视台讲究那些绘画，对吧？讲究那些套话，非常厌恶和反感。你明天就会对什么共同支付等对房地产的打压，对马云的打压会产生一点厌恶，你就会把今天中国所存在的经济上出现的问题都认为习近平干的，都认为习近平出的问题所以这就是这篇文章给了我们一个新的思路。你同不同意他对不对但是至少是在面对中国的问题，中国到底应该选择什么的道路？是完全回到像讲的毛泽东时代，甚至说朝鲜什么东朝鲜西朝鲜时代，还是说呢中国实际上是在寻找一种可能他们认为的稳定的道路，继续要导向现代化，而不是继续的倒退。所以今天的这些政策的调整是基于这样一种思考下的一等调整。
的确，刚才何斌先生提到一个词叫中国式现代化这个词呢，在官方语境中也经常被提及。什么叫做中国式现代化呢？实际上，不管是王毅本人还是习近平都有一个解释，叫做破除现代化就是西方化的迷思，似乎是认为中国必须要走一条和西方不一样的现代化之路。那么这呢，也是孟阿托研究所这一篇研究报告的一个重点，就是习近平所说的中国式现代化到底是怎样的一条现代化之路？是不是就是意识形态一路优先，实用主义经济已经不重要了，我们就是要倒回到60年代这样的一种发展方式那么莫卡托研究所呢，其实他所提出的想法或者是结论，就是一个我们就要说一言难尽，或者是更加复杂。我们看到的是现在呢，共产党似乎对于私营部门有更多的控制不管是黄金股入股，还是对于一些私营企业的监管加压等等等等。但是莫卡托研究所的研究者就提出说恰恰相反，习近平并不是要削弱私营企业，私营企业对于中国一样重要，但是他需要调整整个私营企业的结构。对于那些他认为他需要的企业，他需要进一步的拔高和鼓励支持。对于那些他认为仅仅是在西方化的在这样的一种我们就认为是自由化的发展模式下能够繁荣昌盛的企业比如说之前的这种大金融大消费这一种企业，可能对于中国的长远目标发展不利。那么在习近平式的中国式现代化的图景下，它的地位就变得次要了，甚至是必须要收缩，以避免它带来的安全威胁。习近平对于科技巨头进行了一系列加强监管的措施，在作者看来，这并不是要扼杀科技巨头，恰恰科技整顿的目的是要确保这些巨头哪个和中国的国家战略目标保持一致，对于它进行更多的鼓励；哪一些不符合中国的国家安全体系，特别是在网络和数据安全上，就要它对于优先事项进行相对的降级。因此是有这样的一些层次感的。
对，
那么有一个重要的问题就是，习近平搞的这一套中国式现代化到底能不能够取得成功？这个是真正的问题。
现在只看到痛苦。
对，现在我们是也看到了成功的典型。莫卡托研究所这一份报告还有一个我非常喜欢的一点，就是他对于数十家企业是一一进行了例证分析，哪个企业受到了哪一些政策的影响，哪个企业是国家战略成功的典型，哪个企业是国家打压过分的典型。但是这一篇文章也非常诚恳地讲到，首先，习近平这一条战略路线能不能够取得成功我们说叫做这个精致控制，就像穿绣花针的手一样，你要是穿得准，就正好是把线穿到针眼里面了；你要是穿得不准，可能针就扎到自己的手了。现在还不知道。第二就是的确，这样的模式的成效其实已经显现出来。中国有一些技术最先进、最具备全球竞争力的企业，恰恰是得到了国家支持的企业。因此，现在你还很难说给习近平盖棺论定这一套到底是成功还是失败。那么这一篇整个的研究报告，
在一般的中国的反对习近平的人看见的习近平全部都是失败的。
对，那我们就先来看一看对于阿里的打击，这可能是争议最大的一点那么中国的企业家中有很多呢，是这个非常同情马云先生的遭遇也对于阿里和蚂蚁突然遭到监管的袭击是非常的不忿和不平，也引起了很多中国企业家对于自身安全感的担忧。我们看到阿里是受到了中国政府的各种棍棒压但是现在呢，阿里自己调整战略就非常明确了，叫做一分为六， 和国家和党的议程保持一致啊。现在呢是把自己拆成6个不同的实体，各自的业务路线要分拆出去，有战略重点，有战略弱点，似乎呢是更符合中国现在的监管需求。从这个角度而言啊，拆分的阿里可能是一个更安全的阿里。这呢是文章中对于阿里的分析。同时啊，文章还分析了腾讯的变化。那我们知道啊，腾讯面对游戏行业的加强监管，可以说是当头一棒，因为腾讯的重要的利润来源就是游戏行业。但是现在呢，腾讯也是转变了技术路线，更多的强调，比如说 AI 更多的强调发展本土的自身的系统。比如我昨天就看到有消息说，可能腾讯未来就要面对华为的手机，华为的这个 Harmony 这个我们叫做鸿蒙这个新的系统，开发一系列的应用程序，可以说是支持中国本土的我们叫做这个移动手机系统的发展。那么这可能就是和国家安全事项比较一致的一部分。因此腾讯这个案例其实也是对于腾讯而言，打压固然是非常的严酷的，但是经过打压转型后的腾讯可能又是站稳脚跟这是一点。华为和这个中国似乎是没有享受到大棒的这样的一个打击但是呢，华为在自主创新方面与国家的议程是相对统一一致的，这可能是为华为奠定了国家政策的基础。但是我们相反说，华为在海外的发展可能也是受到了国家对于它支持的限制，引起对于华为更大的安全隐患。再比如比亚迪，那比亚迪呢可以说是吃尽了政策的红利满足了中国政府对于发展电动汽车行业的这个支持的要求，不管是采购优惠政府的订单，还是其他的各种的政策的胡萝卜，那么比亚迪呢都是已经采购到了，并且现在全球出口和投资看上去呢也是前景一片好。文章还举了一些其他我们不太熟悉的公司，比如中远。那么中远呢作为国家的一个战略集团，特别是在一带一路和海外扩张上起着十分重要的战略角色。再比如广汽丰田，广汽丰田是这样的一家合资企业，那么你在外企这个身份方面理论上来讲是有一些微妙的，但是在中国政府眼里呢，广汽是扮演着一个非常重要的角色，特别是在吸引外资，并且呢向中国本土提供就业、税收以及新的汽车工业人才培训方面，因此广汽也是政策的得益者。再比如绿地，中国机器人方面的小霸王、小巨人通过了政策，通过国家的有力支持，是获得了大量的资金和技术来源。现在已经成为了在市场上有很多高新技术和前沿技术的这样的一个中国的先进企业。这篇文章举了很多这样的例子，在这个详细的报告中我们是可以看到这样的我们就说完整的全貌。在文章的最后一节作者就像刚才我们所说的，也为这样的发展战略提出了几个疑点，或者是几个待需解决的问题。首先就是中国是有这样的一个意识形态、地缘政治驱动的议程，但是呢，地缘政治和经济发展之间既有某一种一致关系，在短期也有可能有冲突，需要利弊权衡，需要取舍。而现在中国面临的一个问题是什么呢？特别是在过去的几年里， GDP 的增长正在减弱，经济发展的压力仍然是非常的大。在经济发展压力很大的情况下，你过于强调安全，过于强调地缘政治的优势，可能就会牺牲掉经济发展。这对于中国是不是明智的？中国能不能够含下这个苦果？这个问题还是待需解决的。第二呢，就是中国的这个中产阶级蓬勃的消费市场和中国庞大的这样的一个人口基数，实际上呢还没有发挥出他们的收入潜力和他们的消费潜力，这仍然是中国经济发展的一个重要的我们叫做掣肘点。中国的确现在是进行了军事现代化，的确在一些高科技产业方面是迈出了第一步，甚至是走到了世界的前行。中国也在进行产业升级，但是这样产业升级的红利、科技发展的红利，是不是能够激活整个中国中产阶级消费的大市场？这仍然是中国经济转型面临的一个非常非常重要的挑战。第三个问题就是什么呢？如果你自主创新你建立的这一些本土的企业仅仅是进口替代，什么叫做进口替代呢？原本这一些你是可以在国际市场上获得的，现在你又自己生产了。 从经济学的角度来讲，这是以安全牺牲了效率，因为西方企业或者是外国企业国际大循环可能更有效率，因此你仅仅是用国内的生产替代掉了国际的生产，没有实际的提高中国的生产率，因此效率本身受到的压制仍然是十分关键的一个问题。这呢是这一篇文章对于现在习近平的这个政策策略给出的一个不确定，或者是指出的几个潜在的危险和风险那么对于这个文章作者提出的这几方面的看法，我也想请何明先生谈谈你的观点。
非常好，非常好，真的是很有这个动机就算是你认可习近平的现有的做法，你都可以罗列出来很多的负面的效果。当政府主导这个高科技发展的时候，你政府必须要有绝对的把握，说这个高科技真是有利于你的发展的高科技。也许有一些高科技被证明就未必是的，对吧？所以这样一个巨大的资源的浪费，如果把所有的资源都集中在这个上面，你对其他的产业的照顾不够的话，有时候也会出现生态的这个失衡。而且呢，在中国就业人口这么紧张的情况之下，你的这种高科技的过分的倾斜，而忽视了传统的产业，你从就业的角度来讲，可能就会产生负面效果。现在很多我一些朋友在中国的工厂，他们叫无灯拆间，那无灯拆间你开的再多也没有用所以这都是一些可能性的负面效果。但是不管怎么样，这篇文章它真正的价值是，它抛弃了一般的意识形态，它也抛弃了一般的人云亦云，而是提供了一些基本的案例、一些基本的事实来进行这个展开讨论。这就是西方智库经常会出现这样的文章的意味虽然大部分都大家一样，偶尔的时候有这样的文章被我们的理奇博士发现让我们的观众也能够知道，在西方它不是一等声音。千万不要以为西方这个报纸的评论或者是那个智库的报告就一定是代表西方。西方的层次还是要比中国要丰富很多，这一点我觉得我们应该保持一种学习，一种谦卑的态度。当这些文章出现的时候我们应该是一种期待的态度，哪怕是批评的不符合你的想法，哪怕是赞扬的不符合你的怨恨，我觉得都应该接受一下，多接受一点这种文章，对大家的思维的锻炼其实都是有帮助，何况对认识今天的真实的情况是很有启发的。
最让我觉得有趣的是这一篇文章的作者呢，其实刚才也意识到了何明先生所提到的这个观点就是说他们所提供的观点和事实可能不符合一些人的预期。这一篇文章的作者呢，是在最后我们叫做这个总结结语的部分写了这样的一段话，说现在我们是看到习近平在加强对于中国经济的管控力方面是取得了长足的进步，尽管在中国海外可能有很多人对此觉得失望，但是从触目可及的未来而看习近平的愿景仍然是坚定不移的。那怎么办呢？政策制定者和商界领袖与其改变中国，你可能做的只是要做好相应的规划，并且适应中国。换句话说，有很多时候中国的改变并不符合你的预期，但是你改变中国难上加难，更多的可能只是在现有的改变之下做好适应的决定这番话呢，可能不符合我们的一些观众朋友们的想法，他们呢对于中国可能有更加乐观的这样的一种期许，对于中国未来想走的路线有更加的一种希望中国能够更加融入西方文明这样的看法。习近平的这一条路呢，和很多持有这样观点的观众是不一样的。习近平这条路到底是成功是失败，我们现在也没有办法判断说错。过去几年我们已经看到政策由一个人来决定，没有经过充分考虑可能导致的严重的后果，比如封锁3年，疫情对于中国经济造成了打击。但是我们也看到在国家主导的经济政策下取得的一些成就，比如说中国的高铁，比如中国的一些产业，比如中国在高新技术方面现在走在全世界的领先。因此现在给习近平的政策盖棺论定或许还为期过早，但是可以肯定的是，他一定不是你理想中的这一个政策制定者，而他把中国经济带向了一个不确定的方向。中国经济到底是因此受益还是受害，这一点呢，我们还要 放长远来看。以上就是我们为您介绍的莫卡托经济研究所有关于中国经济发展走势的研究报告。我们今天呢只是截取了其中的一部分内容，为您进行扼要的介绍。但是我们在华尔街电视的华尔街智库栏目中，会把这完整130多页的报告向您进行完整的转播。希望呢您也能够从中获得价值和新的思考。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容，我们下期再会。
谢谢。
Chapter 1: A New Era. Xi Jinping steers China's economy on a different path. After 4 decades of market reform and global integration, China's economy is at a critical juncture. It now faces the most challenging phase of economic development as a new growth model is needed to break through the middle income trap and become more innovative and productive. The third plenum of the 20th Central Committee in fall 2023 will shape China's economic trajectory for years to come. At the third plenum in 2013, Xi Jinping introduced his priorities for political and economic reform, a careful balance between the role of the state and the market. Many abroad were hopeful he might be the reformer China needed, even as his reforms represented a compromise between the more liberal and more conservative forces in the party. Xi Jinping's adjustments to China's economic policies aim to deal with the negative side effects of what he terms unbalanced and inadequate growth, a legacy of the previous growth model. This includes, for example, a highly leveraged financial system and a real estate sector accounting for nearly 30% of GDP. Simultaneously, they are also a response to perceived Western containment and its efforts to limit China's access to technology. Xi Jinping wants new kind of modernity for China by 2049, achieving key milestones and development targets by 2035. The path forward under Xi Jinping will lay the foundation for the Chinese Communist Party's, CCP's, aim of national rejuvenation, returning a strong and prosperous modern China to the center of the global economy and innovation by 2049. Achieving this with China's special economic model, socialism with Chinese characteristics, would establish a system that can outcompete the liberal market economic system and prove that Chinese-style modernization can be dynamic and innovative. If successful, the CCP could establish China as the superior economic system. But there is also a real risk that the economy will hit a period of stagnation during Xi Jinping's third term, as the country confronts a complex set of domestic and international challenges. Title I policy priorities are unlikely to meaningful change even as economy is facing headwinds. At the start of his third term, Xi Jinping clarified his vision of how the CCP should reach its targets for the country. Over his first 2 terms, economic policy shifted towards political, ideological, and security objectives. But 2022 marked a sea change for Xi Jinping's policy priorities and their attendant trade-offs. Xi Jinping's ideological views permeated economic policy, to the detriment of economic growth. To reverse the downturn after the prolonged lockdown of its zero-COVID policy, China has downplayed ideology in 2023, and pragmatism has returned to economic policymaking. This is not a course reversal, but rather a matter of tone and timing. Despite softer language and a less ideological tone, the flurry of rules and regulations imposed in 2020 to 2022 to strengthen the party's grip over the economy have not been abolished. They are simply taking a back seat to boosting investor and consumer confidence amid a disappointing post-COVID recovery. China's leadership has gone into overdrive to woo foreign investors who have become wary of China, not only due to growth prospects but also to political dynamics, both in China and at home. China is now an economic giant, accounting for around 20% of global gross domestic product, GDP, and 30% of global manufacturing. Xi Jinping no longer feels bound to the foundations that guided his predecessors. In the past, leaders tolerated considerable risk in their domestic reforms in order to maximize economic development opportunities. These included the massive displacement of capital and labor with Zhu Rongji's state-owned enterprise, SOE, reforms, or Deng Xiaoping's agenda of opening up and pushing integration with the global economy. This gamble has paid off, and Xi Jinping is setting his sights on taking China to a higher level of development and global influence. In pursuit of the second centennial goal, 100th anniversary of the PRC, Xi Jinping has shifted the party baseline from focusing on economic development to coordinating development and security. This marks a new direction that emphasizes party control over the free hand of the market and puts a greater priority on minimizing risks and achieving political and geopolitical goals than on economic development. China's economic policymaking in the last decade was characterized by an urgency to build an economy that could withstand external shocks. Increasingly, its policy priorities are geared toward a geopolitically oriented economy that is obsessed with US-China competition and deprioritizes the emphasis on social development. A key metric in measuring success is whether or not China can eclipse the US economy. This depends on many factors, including GDP growth in China and the US, inflation and exchange rates. This offers a range of possible outcomes, see Exhibit 1. Following years of strong growth, China's next phase of catching up will be accompanied by slower growth. But success is also measured in relative terms. China sees the US and the West as in decline. Regardless of its relative size to the US economy, China is back on the world stage and will remain an economic heavyweight. Globalization and economic relations with China are likely to be profoundly different in the future. This year's third plenum will have historic significance comparable to the opening up and reform process that began in 1978 or the country's WTO accession in 2001. But while China's rise was largely seen as an opportunity in Europe and elsewhere, fundamental changes are at play that could, once again, shake up the world economy. The third plenum is taking place at an inflection point for China's economy, with several key factors shaping its future development. Point 1. A period of slower and more volatile GDP growth. China's economy is undergoing an inevitable structural slowdown after a period of rapid growth. This requires adjustments to its growth model. Engineering a stable economic slowdown has become more difficult amid China's disruptive policy shifts in response to external and internal challenges such as COVID-19, high debt levels, and the prioritization of national strategic goals in face of rising geopolitical risk. Point 2. Quickly rising innovation capacities that have yet to yield productivity dividends. China has made remarkable strides in boosting its innovation capacity, becoming a cutting-edge nation in a number of technologies ranging from traditional sectors such as high-speed rail to emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. At the same time, China's total productivity growth has decelerated. Point 3. China's gravitational pull on the global economy. Despite slower growth, China is an economic heavyweight aiming to challenge the global economic order, establish itself as an innovation power, and expand its global economic footprint. Point 4. The politicization of globalization. Geopolitical risks and efforts to strengthen economic security in China and worldwide are shaping international global supply chains and innovation. Point 5. Non-convergence with liberal market economies. China is seeking its own development path that serves the goal of perfecting the Chinese socialist system. Under the leadership of the CCP, new theoretical foundations of economic development are being created with an emphasis on tech-centered economic nationalism. Title II Ideology meets Economic Realities. Trade OFFSIN Xi's Tech-Centered Economic Nationalism. Looking forward, a key challenge will be reconciling Xi Jinping's national strategic priorities with economic prospects, including jobs and income. China is neither ending its era of reform and opening up nor returning to the closed Mao years that preceded it. Instead, its internal reform and external opening agendas are taking place under fundamentally different conditions with new political parameters, incentives, and drivers. In the past, internal reform was heavily driven by maximizing development opportunities, while external opening was about accepting interdependencies to accelerate growth and expand export opportunities with liberal market economies. Under Xi Jinping, internal reform is about fine-tuning control of the economy to steer it through domestic hard times with an aging population and sluggish productivity growth. External opening aims to reduce interdependencies with liberal market economies that recently began to restrict China's access to their key technologies. Xi Jinping's answer to these problems is technology, to deal with a shrinking workforce, enhance productivity, and decrease reliance on the US and other countries Beijing believes to be Washington's pawns. The current technology-centered agenda has set the country on a clear trajectory, though its success is far from guaranteed. The sustainability of Xi Jinping's path will be put to the test when ideology-driven ambitions clash with economic reality. For example, despite China establishing itself as a global innovation power, total factor productivity growth has slowed from 22% between 2003 and 2011 to only 5% between 2011 and 2019. Aligning national strategic goals with the national well-being is causing tensions. Another example is the popular backlash in November 2022 over economically stifling zero-COVID policies triggered a rapid course correction, with further corrections taking place amid a sluggish economic recovery in 2023. But this is no paradigm change or return to economic pragmatism. There may be bigger tests ahead if Xi Jinping continues down his chosen path and the strategy fails, see Exhibit 2. Title 311 has chosen China's trajectory, but other actors are choosing how to respond. While countries may only exert limited pressure on China to deviate from Xi Jinping's chartered course, there are plenty of other ways to affect its chances for success. Somewhat oversimplified, countries with liberal market economies may continue to give China access to their markets and technologies, or they may further restrict it. China, on the other hand, may accept economic and technological interdependencies with liberal market economies, or further pursue self-reliance. The issue is that every step China takes towards self-reliance pushes liberal market economies to restrict China's access to their markets and technology. In turn, this drives China further down the road of self-reliance. In that sense, China and liberal market economies are on a path toward long-term, profound disruption to economic and technological globalization, despite likely worse outcomes for all actors. The net positive result for all would be to restore globalization with all sides willing to accept common rules and norms as well as interdependencies. This goes as much for the US, EU and Japan depending on China as it does China depending on them. But the disincentive for China to reverse course and abandon its self-reliance campaign is that liberal market economy countries might cut it off anyway, leaving it too far behind to catch up. The disincentive for liberal market economies to allow China access to their markets is that Beijing might maintain its path to self-reliance and succeed, unleashing China's geopolitical power and replacing them in the global economy. The problem of renewed globalization is that, for each side, the net gain from the best-case scenario is less beneficial than the net damage is from the worst-case scenario, meaning countries have more incentive to take damage-limiting action than to pursue risky opportunities. Furthermore, the growing distrust between China and liberal market economies and previous actions by both China and the US have put everyone in a poor position. Title 4 High Stakes: China's Economic Development is Shaping the Global Order. The evolution of China's political economy, market reforms and integration in the global economy under Xi Jinping will shape its economic path forward. Its development also very much depends on how advanced economies control access to technology. Success or failure not only depend on China's own performance but how liberal market democracies respond to the current structural shifts shaking up the global order. Dealing with an economically large, technological capable, and systemically non-convergent China requires a deep understanding of the structural shifts in China's next stage of development. 1. What are the key building blocks of China's political economy under Xi Jinping's ideology? 2. Which party and state measures are used to steer economic actors? 3. How will the CCP attempt to secure the socio-economic base? 4. How will innovation look under an increasingly authoritarian regime? 5. How will China pursue global integration? Our baseline scenario is that China will continue down Xi Jinping's chosen path, at least as long as he is in power, with continued uncertainty over the success or failure of his strategy. Keen to ensure success, Xi Jinping recently codified his own economic thought in a new development model worthy of his new era. This vision aims to contend with, as he puts it, changes unseen in a century, and is matched with a growing set of measures to shape the economy. These party and state measures aim to operationalize his ideology and galvanize all economic actors to strive for strategic goals, all to enable the success of the 2049 dream. Chapter 2 Xi Jinping's policies serve strategic national goals beyond growth. After the Mao years, China experienced 4 stages of economic development, each characterized by a distinct approach to political economy in respective generations of leadership: de-radicalization, reform and opening up, liberalization, stabilization, and now, under Xi Jinping, securitization, which means assessing all political economy issues as though they were security issues for China. During his first 2 terms, Xi Jinping harnessed the CCP's greatly diminished confidence in market forces as the central driver in resource distribution after the global financial crisis to advance his economic ideology. As Deng Xiaoping de-radicalized the economy in the 1980s, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, remained the undisputed champions, with privately owned enterprises, POEs, only allowed at the cottage industry level, as pragmatism and experimentation took hold. As POEs emerged, the Jiang Zemin era of the 1990s saw the reforms of his premier, Zhu Rongji, who liberalized the economy with a focus on SOE reform under the mantra of grasp the large and let go the small. The state held on to hundreds of the country's most important firms, Lenin's commanding heights of the economy, while the rest were privatized or allowed to collapse. From then on, the national SOEs were largely used to advance the strategic goals of the CCP. Under Hu Jintao in the 2000s, liberalization slowed and SOEs retrenched to stabilize the economy in light of the global financial crisis. SOEs developed infrastructure, supported employment, provided social security, and maintained China's industrial foundation, independent of market forces. Meanwhile, POEs pursued profits, job creation, development, and innovation. Trust in market forces stagnated under Hu, after growing under Deng and Jiang, and then deteriorated under Xi Jinping, see Exhibit 3. Title 111 breaks from the Reform ERA and envisions strategic roles for all companies. Xi Jinping initially wanted to continue Hu's approach to the SOE-POE divide, as expressed in the 2013 Third Plenum Decision document naming both state ownership and market forces as central pillars to development. But faced with emerging and clear risks in 2015-18, Xi Jinping shifted course and pushed back against more reform-minded factions in the party. Key triggers were financial instability, highly leveraged companies, fears of a housing bubble, financial market turbulence in 2015-16. This triggered a deleveraging campaign in 2016 and set the seeds for crackdowns on real estate and tech to control speculative investments and markets not aligned with national strategic goals. Foreign dependencies, already suspicious of the U.S., trust in China's dependency on foreign tech evaporated with the U.S. trade and tech wars starting in 2018 and U.S. President Donald Trump's threats to block telecommunications firm ZTE from American technology. The steady shifts in Xi Jinping's management of the economy are underscored by an attempt to construct or at least project a coherent economic governance model. As a somewhat clearer picture of his vision for the economy emerges, internally promoted as Xi Jinping economic thought for a new era, Deng's era of opening up and reform looks like a transitional period, now possibly succeeded by an era of security and control. According to China's leaders, the country is on a path to completing a historic transformation from standing up and becoming prosperous to growing strong. China's reform process and global integration have substantially advanced living standards and science and technology capabilities. But to reach the new development stage of socialist modernization by 2035, the CCP under Xi Jinping is resorting to policies that held back China's development for decades: ideology, centralization, securitization, and reversing the separation of party and state. After the 19th Party Congress in 2017 and the subsequent Central Economic Work Conference, Xi Jinping economic thought became the CCP's central ideology shaping China's economic development. Loyalty to Xi Jinping and his agenda have always mattered most, as manifested in Xi Jinping's omnipresent anti-corruption campaign launched in 2012. But beyond loyalty and ideological adherence, Xi Jinping thought also demands competence. Xi Jinping still believes that technocrats are best placed to advance the country and has promoted STEM graduates to leadership positions during his tenure at a higher pace than under Hu Jintao. Those cascading requirements, loyalty, ideological alignment, and competence were on full display in the selection of cadres elevated to top leadership at the 20th Party Congress. Competing factions, such as the Communist Youth League, were sidelined while close contacts of Xi Jinping rose to the surface. Anyone with a voice that could have pushed back on Xi Jinping's strategies was suppressed, be it Li Keqiang or Hu Jintao's protege, Hu Chunhua. Meanwhile, promotions were in line for Xi Jinping loyalists like Li Qiang, who stuck to the zero-COVID ideological position that locked down Shanghai for weeks in 2022. Xi Jinping's economic thought is laying the key building blocks for China's economic system. It is defining the role of the state for guiding economic actors and expectations for companies and society, as well as how China engages with the rest of the world. Even more ideological are the goals laid out by the CCP and the means by which Xi Jinping intends to reach them. Economic liberalization as a goal in and of itself is dead in Beijing. It is not seen as compatible with the political system. Xi Jinping's ideological choice has been to extract the tool of market forces from the scrap heap of economic liberalization and to use it only for specific goals, while building out new economic measures in which the party state plays a central role. The CCP dominates the economic system in a similar way it does the political system, through strategic guidance and controlling market mechanisms, and by demanding strict obedience from those companies and individuals that can contribute to national strategic goals. Title II: Xi's economic thought is a continuation in some areas and a clean break in others. Some of the clearest origins of what would later become Xi Jinping economic thought were revealed in August 2020 when Xiaoshi, the CCP's chief theory journal, published a speech he had delivered on November 23, 2015, one of his earliest speeches as paramount leader overviewing his ideological perspective on China's political economy. The speech, made during a study session of the Politburo, outlines key priorities in Xi Jinping's political economic strategy in a post-Third Plenum and pre-19th Party Congress interregnum. Titled Unceasingly Open Up the Borders of Contemporary Chinese Marxist Political Economy, it focuses on 6 key goals. First, adhere to the people-centered development philosophy. Second, adhere to the new development concept. Third, uphold and improve the basic socialist economic system. Fourth, uphold and improve the basic socialist distribution system. Fifth, adhere to the direction of socialist market economic reform. Sixth, adhere to the basic national policy of opening up. Over the rest of his first and second terms in office, these core tenets of what would become Xi Jinping economic thought were matched with Xi Jinping-specific slogans and campaigns. The core goal: adhere to a people-centered development philosophy. This is Xi Jinping's primary aim for his new era. At the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping changed the principal contradiction at the core of CCP thinking from was between the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people and backward social production to between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. Instead of the previous approach of development at all costs, Xi Jinping has now put quality over quantity into the development mix. Subsidiary goals: adhere to the new development concept of quality over quantity. Xi Jinping frequently emphasizes the need to focus on quality development rather than merely driving up the numbers, meaning people-centered development. However, Xi Jinping also often elaborates that the new development concept must balance innovation, coordination, greening, openness, and sharing. The economic model: uphold and improve the basic socialist economic system and adhere to socialist market economic reform. This has been interpreted in the West as raising the role of market forces in allocating resources. Xi Jinping has repeated many times that there are 2 pillars to China's economic model, one public and one non-public. In other words, socialism with Chinese characteristics only works with both strong SOE and strong POE sides to the economy, referred to as the 2 unwavering, meaning unwavering support for both. Economic distribution: uphold and improve the basic socialist distribution system. In China, the basic socialist distribution system is based on distribution according to work, although multiple parallel systems for distribution exist. Xi Jinping would later spotlight distribution in prioritizing common prosperity. The term dates back to Mao, but is known from Deng Xiaoping's famous quote, "Let some get rich first, then lead the rest into common prosperity." Xi Jinping quickly clarified that China will not revert to broad redistribution. Common prosperity is a goal, but not via means like welfare universalism. Over the rest of his first and second terms in office, these core tenets of what would become Xi Jinping economic thought were matched with Xi Jinping-specific slogans and campaigns. China's global economic position: adhere to the basic national policy of opening up. Xi Jinping has no intention of isolating China and is instead eager to grow China's role in the global economy. His signature foreign economic policy has been the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China's major infrastructure project to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe via land and sea. This would grow into Beijing's dual circulation strategy, which aims to alter China's position in the global economy, remaining open to the global economy while boosting domestic demand. Unlike Deng's idea to drive growth by luring technology, investment, and raw materials to produce low to mid-value goods for export, Xi Jinping aims to import raw materials and lower-value goods and export higher-value goods, tech, and outbound investment. Some core priorities of Xi Jinping's economic thought were part of his 2015 speech. Innovation and technology have begun to play a much more central role in Xi Jinping's economic policymaking. The U.S. trade war gave this momentum, especially actions against Chinese tech companies and recent export controls. Xi Jinping has begun to heavily emphasize the all-of-nation effort to close key technology gaps. Consumption-driven growth is also a major focus. This has always been a goal, and is the second half of the dual circulation strategy, external circulation being China's position in the global economy and internal circulation being domestic consumption as the key driver of growth, rather than exports. See Exhibit 4. Title 3. The trade war and the pandemic catalyzed deeply rooted self-reliance in Xi's economic thought. Xi Jinping consolidated his power base over his first 2 terms, but there were limitations as to how aggressively he could push his then still evolving economic ideology. First, it was difficult to get buy-in for his radical approach to self-reliance from most economic actors at a time when China had virtually complete access to foreign markets and technologies. Second, the CCP's very legitimacy had, since the crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protests, been dependent on securing economic development gains in return for political silence from the masses, meaning that Xi Jinping needed to keep growth strong, irrespective of his ideology. 2 things happened to change this: the US-China trade and tech war and the pandemic. Self-reliance is a long-standing principle in CCP ideology, indeed, of any communist or more generally authoritarian ideology. However, aside from more ideologically conservative types in the CCP and China's major SOEs, much of China's private sector, scientific community, and broader society were not behind the idea. The US-China trade war, and the more significant tech war that began with restrictions on Huawei and ZTE, changed that around 2018. Private companies faced being technologically strangled by the US. For the first time in decades, there was truth behind the idea of an all-of-nation effort to close the tech gap and achieve self-reliance. This opened up considerable political space for Xi Jinping to push his economic ideology. See Exhibit 5. The pandemic did something similar. China's initial failure to contain the virus was later met with an effective zero-COVID policy that, despite its often draconian nature, worked for the first 2 years. Compared to the rest of the world, China seemed stable and back to normal life, something state media was happy to demonstrate with coverage of global chaos next to rosy reports about Beijing's leadership. This gave Xi Jinping political space to deprioritize economic growth as a measure of success in pursuit of other political goals. This is not to say that multiple crackdowns on the tech sector, private tutoring, or the real estate sector would not have happened in absence of the pandemic, but the unquestionable legitimacy of COVID measures offered a window of opportunity to advance these goals. Title for the transformation from China Incorporated to CCP Incorporated. Xi Jinping economic thought did not emerge by design but evolved in response to weak spots in the domestic economy and shifts in the external environment, marked by confrontation with the US, all of which empowered Xi Jinping's vision for the economy. The CCP seeks to increasingly dominate the economic system just like the political system. It uses strategic guidance to contain misguided market decisions that increase financial risks and fail to advance strategic objectives or de-risk from the West. Economic policy is becoming more problem-oriented, preparing the nation for difficulties ahead. One priority is to re-establish the party's leadership in China's modernization efforts and foster the securitization of everything. This has allowed the CCP to reach into the private sector, which in Xi Jinping's view has become detached from national interests and has contributed to systemic risks in the financial sector. As a result, some of China's most successful and celebrated private companies found themselves up against a wall. First, a deleveraging campaign launched in 2016 targeted highly indebted companies, especially in the real estate and property sectors, which had contributed to excessive debt and risks to the financial system. While SOEs were also targeted in an effort to improve their performance, regulators started to focus on private companies including the rapidly expanding industrial conglomerate HNA Group and Onbuying Insurance Group in 2017. The companies have since ended in bankruptcy or become defunct with their founders imprisoned. Some of the most successful companies and entrepreneurs were increasingly seen as rivals to the CCP's grip on power. Most prominent was the halting of the world's largest IPO in 2020, Ant Financial, after founder Jack Ma made comments challenging the state-dominated banking system. His subsequent de facto silencing sent a signal to other entrepreneurs about who was in charge, which was combined with a broader crackdown on tech firms accused of disorderly expansion of capital. This meant they had done so well that too much capital was flowing their way at the expense of investment in areas designated by Beijing. This can be seen as a follow-up to Xi Jinping's first anti-corruption campaign targeting officials. But this time, the CCP targeted the private sector and entrepreneurs to force their alignment with the ideological and political goals of the party state. While not a return to a command economy through state takeovers of private firms, it is a new model that raises party interests above both the state and the private sector, thus advancing the transformation from China Incorporated to CCP Incorporated. Title 5 All economic actors must advance strategic goals. Xi Jinping's economic vision has expanded over the years. His elevation of the party is a remarkable shift in China's political economy. Hu Jintao once tried to rein in state-owned enterprises that had wandered from their core industries but failed due to vested interests. Even the People's Liberation Army, PLA, was notorious prior to Xi Jinping for its wide array of investments in the private sector. Leveraging ideology, Xi Jinping managed not only to rein in SOEs and get the PLA to divest, but expanded the CCP's control over private companies. Xi Jinping's tenure in office began with a clear continuation of Hu Jintao's dual-pillar economic model. POEs were responsible for growth and innovation, SOEs were responsible for stability and intervention. The extent of party involvement depends largely on two factors. First, the strategic relevance of a given firm. This spans from the most strategically important firms on one end, the tech gap closers that help overcome China's technological deficit in relation to liberal market economies, to the strategically important, though less critical high-value development drivers that are the new areas of growth that help China climb global value chains, and also to the least strategically relevant, though still important, economic baseline holders that fulfill the roles of maintaining employment, managing logistics and traditional infrastructure, and even to those sectors viewed with hostility from Beijing. Second, the degree of party-state control/guidance, which operates on a scale from high to low. This is reflected in the areas in which the CCP needs to advance control to drive innovation or consolidate and advance monopolistic national champions at home and abroad, as well as the areas in which the CCP wants to have greater control, such as over digital champions that process vast quantities of consumer data, or in the sectors Beijing wants to suppress for political reasons, such as the gaming industry and private tutoring, see Exhibit 6. This shift from a division of labor in which SOEs had certain roles and POEs had others to one based not on ownership type but on the strategic relevance and degree of control over individual actors creates many niche roles that companies can occupy in Xi Jinping's new economic model. Chapter 3 The Party State's Emerging Toolkit Gets Companies in Line. On the surface, it might seem the market reform process is advancing, if not even accelerating. Xi Jinping rhetorically supports the decisive role of the market, and he and his cadres often repeat the line that private firms provide 50% of tax revenue, 60% of GDP, 70% of innovation, and 80% of urban employment. The share of private companies in key sectors and their presence in the top 100 companies has steadily increased. 16 China's financial markets have also become more sophisticated. Private companies are omnipresent and financial markets have adjusted to serve the needs of these innovation drivers. Over the past 15 years, stock exchanges like Chinext, 2009, Star Market, 2019, and the Beijing Stock Market, 2021, were launched to provide funding for the country's fast-growing companies that were not adequately served by the state-owned banking system. Venture capital also grew alongside new investment channels for foreigners, such as the Stock Connect mechanism, which allows participation in Chinese capital markets like Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. Today, such market reforms are not being rolled back, but the function and scope of prices determining economic activities has become far more restrictive. Prices as a coordinating mechanism fluctuate within a lower and upper band in which the government is comfortable, similar to the managed exchange rate of the renminbi, RMB. Sudden and rapid changes increasingly trigger a policy response to correct the market. Faced with increasing capital outflow pressure from a depreciating exchange rate, the People's Bank of China, PBOC, introduced an opaque counter-cyclical factor, an adjustment to daily yuan quotes by the central bank, to help guide the market. Another prominent example was the heavy-handed government intervention during the stock market crash in 2015 or interventions to manage commodity prices in 2021. With increasing levels of intervention, prices are losing their significance as a regulator in the economy. Increasingly, the CCP is the deciding factor determining levels of supply, production, and investment. Title 111 isn't unwinding earlier reforms, but is giving the CCP a stronger role. As private companies have gained a foothold in strategically relevant sectors, the CCP has had to develop a new disciplinary system and incentive structure to compel rent-seeking entrepreneurs to serve the party's interests. This was done in part by regulatory intervention in previously largely unregulated sectors. To increase political and operational control over private companies, regulatory measures have been complemented by stronger party affiliation of the management and traditional economic guidance tools via the state-controlled financial system. As the structure of the economy has changed, the party state has supplemented its toolkit, turning increasingly to the private sector to achieve ambitious national priorities. As demonstrated with Alibaba, Beijing is using this growing set of policies, regulations, and informal instruments to reshape economic actors that do not align with strategic goals, or to direct support and guidance to firms that are generally on board. These new tools fall broadly into three categories: ownership/governance, sticks, and carrots. These are discussed briefly here but are illustrated in detailed case studies at the end of this report. Ownership/governance: direct ownership, mixed ownership/reverse mixed ownership, golden shares, party roles in decision-making, market access restrictions, vertically integrated value chains, facilitated investment/divestment. Ownership/governance tools give Beijing direct influence in the decision-making processes of economic actors. Some of this happens through traditional means like direct ownership of SOEs at the central or even local level of the government, or through market access restrictions that have historically forced foreign private companies into joint ventures, JVs, with, often state-owned, local partners, thus creating channels for the party state to guide decisions. Others are the result of more recent efforts like mixed ownership reform efforts that in many ways tied SOEs and private companies together, or the application of golden shares in certain companies to ensure the party state has certain veto powers. Finally, the party state has other unique means to intervene, such as through party roles of board members, the ability to facilitate investment or divestment, to offload toxic assets from firms like the troubled real estate behemoth Evergrande, or to raise funds through rapid sales like tech giant Huawei did with its Honor smartphone brand, or the ability of the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, SASAC, to use its ownership of multiple SOEs in a given value chain to coordinate action. Sticks: regulatory direction, crackdowns and rectifications. IPO blocks: common prosperity demands assignment to national teams. Sticks in Beijing's arsenal give it the means to drive unruly actors away from the things Beijing doesn't include in its objectives. This can happen through traditional regulatory direction, both to drive legitimate compliance, like with the new cyber and data legal regime, or as means of political signaling through crackdowns and rectification campaigns, like choosing the internet platform sector for its first round of cyber and data rules enforcement to send a message to other industries. This can also include steps like scuttling planned IPOs at the political direction of Xi Jinping himself. Some sticks don't look so offensive or damaging, but instead are means of atonement, like embracing common prosperity by putting billions into common prosperity funds or joining national teams to help close strategic technology gaps. Carrots: direct subsidies/tax relief policy, banks, cheap loans, advantageous stock listings, implicit guarantees, state guidance funds, little giant status, HNT status, insured customer base, R&D support, protected home market. Carrots are a way for Beijing to direct support to economic actors already aligned with national goals to help facilitate their success. They include many traditional means of state aid like subsidies, tax relief, cheap loans from state-run commercial and policy banks, implicit guarantees for SOEs, and protection from foreign competition. However, new support mechanisms have emerged in recent years to help achieve strategic goals, especially those related to closing the tech gap, advantageous stock listings in tech and SME-specific markets, state guidance funds, status as a little giant, small firms in important areas of development, or as a high and new technology enterprise. Insured customer bases through public procurement or support from SOE customers, and extensive support in R&D through China's innovation chain strategy. Title II: the growing cast of roles for POIs. Economic policies increasingly focus on private enterprises, particularly high-tech small and mid-size enterprises, SMEs, as key actors to solve core issues like technological bottlenecks and economic self-reliance. See Exhibit 7. The tech sector has benefited from walled gardens protecting them against foreign competition. Now that they have blossomed into strategically relevant companies, the CCP is beginning to tighten its grip. Private firms' increasing prominence in policies also entails greater party-state guidance to focus on core objectives, see Exhibit 8. Prominent cadres call on private enterprises to continuously increase S&T innovation efforts and to strive to become the force to solve the bottleneck technology problem. The government understands that private firms often have the dynamism and creativity that SOEs lack to innovate and commercialize emerging technologies, which are key ingredients for China's new development agenda. The greater guidance of private enterprises is accompanied by new carrots and sticks. If private companies follow party-state guidance, they stand to benefit from direct and indirect policy support and improved financing options. A top-level policy published in 2019 by the CCPCC and the State Council is directed at improving the business environment and financing options for private firms to harness their innovation for national goals. Furthermore, the party has greater expectations of the private sector to fulfill national priorities and unswervingly listen to and follow the party at all times. This does not mean that all companies are tightly controlled by the party state, far from it. The bulk of private firms fall outside of the areas deemed strategically relevant by Beijing. Even in some important industries like the new energy vehicle (NEV) sector, which is critical for China's green transition and is also an important growth sector where Chinese firms are on the cutting edge, the party state has given considerable space to private actors. It has adopted a surprisingly lax approach to directing NEV makers while also throwing mountains of state aid into the sector to drive up demand, effectively dedicating a large field where contenders could take root with ample fertilizer for all. Only after some NEV makers emerged as commercially viable did Beijing begin to tighten standards and cut off state aid, eventually leading the weakest players to exit the field and leave the remaining space to China's most promising NEV brands. Since at least the 2013 third plenum, the leadership has been optimizing economic policies in order to establish a more efficient economic system, driven in part by market forces, that also responds to the guidance of the party. Xi Jinping recognizes the superiority of a competitive environment in allocating economic resources in terms of market efficiency for the purposes of growth and general development. However, in areas where investment would not be efficient from a market perspective, but where the leadership urgently needs China to be technologically competitive on a global scale, party-state intervention is essential. From the perspective of the CCP, this is not seen as a contradiction. In Xi Jinping's era, the share of POE in China's fixed asset investment has deteriorated by nearly 10 percentage points. Despite these notable shifts, China is not a command economy in which all companies follow the party overlord by investing in the real economy. The deterioration of POE investment is mainly due to a slowdown in services and real estate, while investment in manufacturing has been growing in the double digits. But the private sector remains fairly reluctant to follow the CCP's growing influence, requiring the CCP to develop new tools for control and guidance. Private companies continue to have similar opportunities as in far more capitalistic systems. But market mechanisms, including how private companies and financial markets operate, are increasingly guided, if not dominated, by the CCP. All in all, the CCP is trying to come up with a system of economic rules that forcefully merges party control with market mechanisms. Chapter 4: Beijing advances technological self-reliance by all means. Xi Jinping's geopolitically focused political economy is on full display in the way innovation is being pursued in China, as well as how the country's innovation dividend is materializing. Considering the remarkable progress that China has made in advancing itself as a technological great power, there would normally be an expectation that total factor productivity would have climbed as the returns on innovation gains kick in. Instead, total factor productivity has trended downward, begging the question of where the dividend has gone. Rather than going towards productivity, much of it has gone towards Xi Jinping's tech self-reliance goals. This is because in most technologies, China is playing catch-up in terms of tech effectiveness, but it has enjoyed extensive access to foreign technology. In previous years, Chinese firms could simply acquire the foreign technology to maximize their return, which could bring productivity growth. Instead, Xi Jinping has set the country on a path where, in many key areas, it is more important that companies expensively develop the tech themselves. Had China instead focused on its own comparative advantages and accepted interdependencies on others in areas where it lagged, the innovation dividend would likely have moved the needle up on productivity, but instead, it has only gone to closing tech gaps, see Exhibit 9. The tech self-reliance priority has now been cemented in place. Now facing a showdown with the U.S. and its allies, Xi Jinping has called for a new type of whole-of-nation approach in the 2020 Central Economic Work Conference to close technology gaps and rid China of its dependency on the foreign actors he believes intend to contain his country. Several clear patterns in these efforts have emerged in the national strategy. First, closing gaps across as many strategic technologies as possible. Second, in strategic technologies where China has achieved effective competitiveness, protecting market share from foreign competition so indigenous firms can achieve market efficiency. Third, in strategic technologies where China remains far behind, attracting foreign investment where possible and continuing to import from abroad where necessary. Title I: Innovate Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. In an attempt to better align innovation and industry, the CCP is setting up new hierarchies within the economy. By mixing tested methods with a stronger embrace of technocratic laboratory capitalism, a form of capitalism that operates in a highly controlled environment, the CCP aims to increase centralization and coordination of economic actors. While higher levels of political control may hinder innovation of privately owned companies, the CCP is also attempting to integrate them into China's evolving innovation ecosystem, including networking them with national research institutions, universities, and other companies. The government has also recognized the private sector's strength in emerging technology and incentivizes technology development and competition by reducing their financial risk. The new type of centralized administration of innovation aims to accelerate innovation in strategic areas by aligning the private and state sectors in pursuing national strategic targets. Ministries and relevant departments play a crucial role in developing the required plans, including roadmaps, timetables, and responsibilities. The plans set the framework for direct and indirect financial incentives that help steer market actors toward the most efficient way to reach targets. In sectors where POEs dominate, they compete for full government support, currently especially seen in semiconductors, but previously for electric vehicles, EVs. Likewise, in sectors where SOEs dominate, they are expected to help reach goals by transforming themselves into profitable drivers of innovation. This is consistent with the emphasis on POEs and SOEs as pillars of the Chinese economy outlined in the 2013 Third Plenum. Increasingly, both are operating in a similar environment, with the CCP exerting control over their operational direction regardless of their ownership. Yet, it is not simply down to POEs and SOEs to contribute to the leadership's call for innovation. In line with the whole-of-nation approach, Beijing has been refining its approach to bringing the party-state and the scientific community in at early stages and then fostering commercialization at the corporate end of China's innovation chain. The intention of the innovation chain is to centralize and streamline everything from the earliest basic research to eventual commercialization, first in terms of tech effectiveness and then market efficiency, all with the party-state guiding and supporting each actor along the way. Encapsulating the whole-of-nation approach is the role that larger POEs and SOEs are also meant to play in the innovation chain. This includes expectations that they support the scientific community in the research phase, and often also invest either in their own subsidiaries, which then benefit from tech transfer, or in startups, providing much-needed capital and business support. For China's startups seen as having the potential to close the technology gap in key areas, that support can also come through China's Little Giants initiative. Little Giants provides extensive support to qualifying SMEs through the innovation chain model and by connecting them with financial markets like the Beijing stock market. See the case study on the Little Giant Company Leader Drive at the end of this chapter. In 2022, 40% of listings on the Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing stock exchanges were made by Little Giant companies. Title II: Taking indigenous champions from tech effectiveness to market efficiency. As innovation is often a contest of incremental improvements, technology that is one or two steps behind the cutting edge can still achieve much of what its most advanced version can. An EV with a range of 200 kilometers can fulfill most of the same needs of commuter drivers as an EV with a range of 300 kilometers. And a chip made with the 22 nanometers process can achieve in a smartphone much, but certainly not all, of the same functionality as a 14 nanometers version. Even if the more advanced tech can do some things its lesser version cannot, there is still enough overlap to satisfy many customers. Obviously, Beijing would like to be on the cutting edge in many technologies, but it will often settle first for getting close enough to produce most of the desired applications of a given tech. This tried-and-true formula has been demonstrated most clearly in the area of high-speed rail, HSR, technology. China's ambition to create an HSR network was hampered by a lack of expertise and technology to build domestic models. Foreign HSR companies were invited into the market and required to enter JVs and transfer technology to local players such as Northern and Southern rolling stock companies CNR and CSR. Brands like Kawasaki, Alstom, Siemens and Bombardier all jumped into the market hoping to become the dominant players. Over time, CNR and CSR merged into a single monopolistic giant CRRC, which then had access to all of the transferred foreign tech and eventually caught up and managed to produce technologically effective alternatives to the foreign brands. It didn't take long for the procurement system in charge of purchasing engines and rolling stock to favor CRRC over its foreign competitors, effectively pushing them out of the market aside from some niche tech related to HSR. Since then, China's HSR network has dwarfed all others. Anyone who has ridden the CRRC Fuxing National Rejuvenation Line, which is the exclusive intellectual property of CRRC, can tell you how its speed and smooth ride make European high-speed rail feel outdated. A similar story is currently playing out with Huawei, which has overtaken its rivals in 5G technology and now enjoys a protected home market to build out almost entirely without foreign competition. Beyond that, Huawei is central to Beijing's strategic ambition to close other technology gaps, and the company is covered in a case study at the end of this chapter. Some of the same rules that are benefiting Huawei as sources of protection in its home market are also applicable to other sectors. Xi Jinping's ambition to securitize China in every possible way has created regulatory and other means to drive out undesirable foreign competition in certain industries, but also to compel the rest of the foreign business community and local firms to integrate with indigenous tech in affected areas. This is happening most sharply in the critical information infrastructure (CII) space, where suppliers of relevant information communications technology (ICT) and digital solutions must be whitelisted by a multitude of government bodies for customers designated as CII operators. The rules have a massive negative impact on foreign suppliers and operators. The former report to the European Chamber of Commerce that they face far higher levels of scrutiny than their local competitors, while the latter say they often need to gut their hardware and software used globally and furnish their China operations with indigenous solutions. A less deep-cutting, but more widespread, source of protectionism is the Autonomous and Controllable ANC campaign, which aims to ensure value chains that can go it alone if needed. Importantly, as more and more industries undergo digitalization and rely more on networking and automation, there is a higher likelihood they will fall under greater scrutiny as operators. It is hard to imagine that Beijing will allow highly automated chemical plants, in a country with a history of exploding chemical plants, or autonomous vehicles to operate without much more oversight and intervention from authorities. Title III: Drawing in foreign tech where possible, importing it where necessary. It is impossible to talk about China's own tech self-reliance ambitions without also covering the very dependencies on foreign technologies it seeks to remedy. Where China remains too far behind foreign technology providers, it approaches self-reliance through opening up. The onshoring of foreign technology brings the tech within China's borders and under Beijing's jurisdiction, a much preferred choice to importing it and being subject to potential restrictions from the US or elsewhere. This can mean removing restrictions, but also rolling out the red carpet with additional support measures to incentivize onshoring. While a variety of external restrictions make it impossible, Beijing would eagerly provide abundant support to companies on the cutting edge in the semiconductor value chain. Firms like TSMC, ASML, Nikon, and Intel could effectively name their price if they onshored their most advanced production. A similar situation emerged for foreign chemical makers BASF and ExxonMobil when they each announced plans in 2018 to build plants valued at $10 billion in Guangdong. These chemical plants will produce highly advanced chemicals for customers in China that previously would have been imported, which would potentially have subjected them to disruption. To facilitate this investment, Beijing approved 100% foreign ownership for each investment, something that had never before happened in China. Finally, China will reluctantly continue to import foreign technology where it has no other choice, though it will simultaneously focus efforts on closing the tech gap in these areas. This is most widely the case in the semiconductor space, where China must import the most cutting-edge chips that empower its own innovation system and its exports, albeit with much greater difficulty since the October 2022 restrictions on U.S. chip tech and the early 2023 joint agreement of the U.S., Japan, and the Netherlands to restrict exports of the most advanced lithography machines. However, this applies to far more technologies than Beijing would like. Just to name a few, due to their status as military contractors in the US and Europe, many of Airbus and Boeing suppliers are only allowed to export certain components to Chinese passenger airliner Aspirin Comac. A multitude of European and Japanese industrial machinery makers will only export their most cutting-edge products to China. Legions of hidden champions / so-called middle-stand firms that fill niche roles as the primary, or even sole, providers of certain components have the luxury of a seller's market and are under no pressure to onshore. Title 4 Seeking tech supremacy, China has used dominance in manufacturing and raw materials as leverage. In one of his signature speeches, Some Major Problems Facing Medium to Long-Term National Economic and Social Development, published in Xiushi, the CCP's Theory Journal, in late 2020, but originally delivered in April 2020, Xi Jinping expounded on his vision for China that was very technology-centric. Coming out of the intense initial lockdowns at the start of the pandemic, the speech called first for a resilient domestic market to decrease reliance on foreign demand and second for localized value chains and secure technology access. One plank for achieving secure technology access is by catching up and overtaking the technological high ground so that Beijing will have deterrence through a sort of technological mutually assured destruction position. Specifically, Xi Jinping envisions Assassin's Mace Technologies, the Chinese equivalent of a trump card, something which can be unexpectedly thrown into a contest or a fight that changes the dynamic. The ambition is to establish China as the dominant tech supplier for an emerging technology that will be in high demand globally. From that position, Beijing would control its own tech bottleneck, which it could credibly use against other markets, much in the way Washington uses the semiconductor bottleneck to gain a hold on China. The effect would be deterrence, so the US would think twice about cutting China off from its chip technology lest China cut the US off from its bottleneck technology. This could be in AI, quantum computing, life sciences, or new materials, anything China is currently on the edge of and which could become critical in empowering not just one or two end products, but multiple value chains, and a country's innovative capacity itself. For now, that also means other technologies that can drive deterrence. Beijing's early 2023 crafting of restrictions on outbound intellectual property related to photovoltaic, solar panels, tech opens the door to a kind of export control over a key technology for the green transition, and one where China holds around 80% of the global market share in the full value chain for solar panels. Meanwhile, on July 3, 2023, China's Ministry of Commerce announced export controls on gallium and germanium-related materials on the grounds that they have dual-use applications. China produces around two-thirds of the world's germanium and 97% of its gallium, with each mineral being the base for a variety of applications in semiconductor, optics, and electronics more generally. This came after the Netherlands announced details of its own restrictions on exports of cutting-edge lithography machines aligned with the US and Japan. Beijing clearly had prepared its own response and kept it ready to play at the right moment as a possible deterrent. Gallium, for example, is essential for cutting-edge chip wafers made by Japanese firms, used by Korean and Taiwanese chip makers, all made with Japanese and Dutch lithography machines. Chapter 5 Xi Jinping's emerging social contract puts strategic objectives first. China's economic transition has been a remarkable success. In the process, over 800 million people have escaped poverty. Just in time for the CCP's centennial in 2021, Xi Jinping declared the end of extreme poverty. The annual income of at least 100 million people had exceeded 4,000 renminbi, China's definition as the rural poverty line. In 2022, GDP per capita reached $12,720, putting it close to the World Bank's definition of a high-income country of $13,845.59, but this still leaves China below Bulgaria, $13,772, and Romania, $15,892, the countries with the lowest GDP per capita in the EU. Solely focusing on national GDP per capita levels in China might be misleading as it is already an innovation power to reckon with. In a large economy like China, various development stages take place simultaneously. Already 42% of its population lives in regions that would be categorized as high income by the World Bank. Jiangsu, Fujian, Zhejiang and Guangdong all have a GDP per capita greater than $15,000 in 2022. Together, their population is over 330 million, giving China a very sizable middle class. Despite this remarkable success in improving the well-being of society, China's economic policies have remained geared toward supporting industry in pursuit of greater technological sophistication. Reaching national strategic goals requires large capital investments in infrastructure, production capacity, and science and innovation. Empowering the autonomy of private households' consumption patterns is not compatible in a system that seeks greater centralization and control. After all, consumers might not buy what the party wants them to. This sets limits to the decade-old demands for rebalancing the economy to rely less on investment. In Xi Jinping's economic logic, it is a strong capacity to provide effective supply that creates jobs and income, and from that follows demand. The type of socialism that Xi Jinping envisions for China emphasizes ideology and nationalism. A fundamental part of this are collectivist principles as an important feature of China's economic system. This means that the nation's interest supersedes that of the individual. While individuals are not yet only seen as a means to an end by the CCP, more repressive structures in the political economy are limiting their corridors of economic activity. Advancing authoritarian elements as a key principle of governance under the leadership of Xi Jinping is leaving its marks on the socio-economic structure of the country. As in other parts of China's economy, the CCP is advancing its position and guidance over economic actors. This does not bode well for a substantial shift in China's growth model toward more household consumption and has significant implications for China's development path. Title I: Consumption-driven growth fails to lift OFF. One of Xi Jinping's signature policy agendas, the dual circulation strategy, is centered around just that. The core principle is to shift China from its previous model of export and investment-driven growth to one that is primarily fueled by domestic consumption, and in which exports play a supplementary role. However, broad acknowledgement that such a shift toward consumption-driven growth is necessary does not inherently facilitate that transition. There are other priorities to consider, and Xi Jinping has clearly ranked consumption-driven growth as a second-tier goal. Countries with higher government control over the economy have generally lower degrees of private consumption. The household consumption share of GDP has barely improved since Xi Jinping's first term in 2013, going from 34.3% in 2010 to 38.5% in 2021, basically the same level over the past 5 years. Despite a long debate on the transition to a more sustainable growth model, investment remains the most important element in the economy. This should not come as a surprise, as achieving industrial policy objectives takes precedence over advancing socio-economic targets. A higher share of consumption and the autonomy of households would counter efforts toward greater centralization of China's economic system favoring industrial policy, see Exhibit 11. The household consumption share of GDP for countries classified as middle income by the World Bank is typically around 50%, while for high-income countries the share is around 60%. In isolation, the failure of the dual circulation strategy to drive change might suggest a policy failure, but in the broader context of Xi Jinping's economic policymaking, it is rather a failure caused by trade-offs. From the perspective of Xi Jinping's economic thought, however, a low household consumption share should be understood as a feature of China's economic system rather than a structural problem. Title II: The Rebuttal of the Welfare State. Socioeconomic indicators stagnate under 11. Advancing socioeconomic policies and redistribution have not been the mainstay of the CCP since it embarked on economic reforms, and are not under Xi Jinping either. Xu Rongji ended the Mawara social safety net of the company-level work unit during the reform of SOEs in the 1990s. Disbanding the Iron Rice Bowl was replaced by a laissez-faire social system akin to a neoliberal economy. Any substantial rebalancing effort would require a meaningful redistribution and increased social expenditure by the government, which would come at the expense of investments in expanding manufacturing capabilities and innovation. This requires change to be institutionalized rather than a campaign-style approach such as battling extreme poverty. These priorities are unlikely to change anytime soon under Xi Jinping despite ambitious social reforms announced in 2013. Public spending on health, education, social security, and employment largely remained unchanged in Xi Jinping's first 2 terms, reaching 8.1% in 2022. Xi Jinping has inherited many of the problems of previous leaders, but despite some lip service to structural reform, he continues to kick the can down the road. Addressing these long-lasting structural issues will become even more pressing as GDP growth slows, society ages and the working population shrinks further from its peak in 2015, and highly leveraged local governments struggle to fund social services, see Exhibit 12. The lack of a proper social safety net helps explain China's exceptionally high savings rate. Households save money for healthcare or retirement rather than consume. High saving rates in turn promote an investment-led growth model as it facilitates cheap capital. Savings as a share of GDP have held steady at levels close to 45% since 2013. China's saving rate is almost in a league of its own and far higher than for middle or high-income countries as classified by the World Bank. The impression of hyperconsumption in China's modern megacities or online retail frenzy do not reflect the macroeconomic reality but rather a snapshot of the society, and entrenched inequality. China's inequality has remained persistent but has been less of a policy issue for as long as economic growth remains strong enough to improve the lives of all income groups. This has given the CCP the liberty to set economic policy priorities other than strengthening the social system, see Exhibit 13 and Exhibit 14. Title III Common Prosperity is more symbolism than structural change. The failure to direct more income to households belies another core tenet of Xi Jinping's economic ideology in practice. Common prosperity re-entered the lexicon in 2021 when it was wielded alongside the broader crackdowns on digital tech and real estate. Many initially expected that large-scale redistribution was in store, but this failed to materialize beyond some talk of tertiary distribution, the redistribution from wealth via donation or charities. Companies got the message to take on more social responsibility by expanding philanthropic work, including donating to those in need and setting up funds focusing on rural development and announcing measures to reduce the income gap within companies. Under Xi Jinping, the flashy display of wealth by business elites is becoming less fashionable and potentially risky. China's entrepreneurs could be facing consequences similar to local officials during the anti-corruption campaign in the early days of Xi Jinping's rule. In response, officials could no longer hold fancy banquets or be seen with expensive watches. There is an increasing expectation of modesty and the need to demonstrate a role in developing the nation. As a result, China's billionaires donated a record sum of $10 billion in 2022, more than a drop in the bucket. Common prosperity has been used alongside pressure on China's most innovative companies to put their capital and expertise to use in achieving national strategic goals, like closing the technology gap. But common prosperity is not about deriving prosperity for the working class at the expense of higher taxes on the wealthy or increasing costly social services. Xi Jinping's policies, including a crackdown on private companies and elites, in part resemble populist policies introduced by disgraced former senior CCP official Bo Xilai in Chongqing, who was convicted of embezzlement, but they do not concretely address key issues including redistribution and inequality. So far, his efforts pale in comparison to those under former President Hu Jintao, who expanded labor legislation, including contract law and a more serious implementation of minimum wage and improved access to medical insurance for migrant workers, although these efforts lost steam at the end of his term in 2012. Ironically, Xi Jinping's vision of Chinese socialism comes with a rejection of Western-style socialism with its stronger role for the state. Instead of deepening institutional reforms, the responsibility of providing is left in large part to individuals themselves while the state contribution is kept to a minimum. Stronger guidance on companies under common prosperity is little more than signaling right now, but if accelerated, could shift toward a larger burden falling directly on companies. This sentiment is also captured in the case study on Tencent at the end of this chapter. The company was front and center during the consumer internet/platform crackdowns of 2020 to 2021, and it has been pushed by Beijing to align its strengths towards supporting the real economy. Furthermore, Beijing has heavily punished the gaming side of Tencent's operations, with tight regulations not only limiting approvals for new games, but for restricting gaming time for some users. The result is that the company has been cowed domestically and is strategically going overseas to make up for the lost business opportunities within China. Title for the new social contract means contributing to national rejuvenation. Policies under Xi Jinping increasingly appear motivated by non-economic targets that do not aim to increase profits or the welfare of individuals and private companies, but rather to promote self-reliance and national power, including military power. Allocating national resources to building a welfare state is a luxury the CCP does not want to pursue in a time of growing systemic rivalry with the U.S. Increasingly, the economic beneficiaries of China's development in past decades, notably entrepreneurs, the wealthy and the middle class, will now be expected to be grateful to the party for allowing them to be far better off than the hard-working generations before them. The new message is, don't become complacent. Tighten your economic belts and roll up your sleeves to do what is in your power to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. Aligning national strategic priorities with jobs and income is becoming more difficult as China deals with a more demanding middle class and its needs for jobs and income. This comes as social fault lines are becoming more complex. Youth unemployment reached record levels of over 20% in Q2 2023, yet companies are struggling to fill vacancies in factories. One reason for this is a growing mismatch of skills and expectations. Workers with the vocational skills needed in manufacturing are scarce. On the other hand, not every university graduate will become a high-profile scientist helping China close the technology gap. Encouraging youth to work in the countryside seems to be a hard sell for an aspiring future generation. Most young urbanites most likely do not expect to return to rural life, nor are they keen to work in 3D manufacturing jobs, dirty, demanding, difficult. Creating a large middle class, one of China's biggest economic reform successes, now looks like a potential vulnerability for the CCP. There is a real risk that parts of society will see a stagnation, or even a possible deterioration, in economic well-being. The CCP will need to respond to these demands of the middle class. It has already shown a return to pragmatism following intense economic pressure built up during the 3-year zero-COVID policy. The CCP must control social economic risks using, for example, extensive party and state intervention in sectors like real estate, most infamously with the debt-ridden property giant Evergrande, but also to provide an economic baseline that ensures employment and income to satisfy the minimum needs of the majority of society. Beijing views the role of most companies as holding that economic baseline. This includes companies with a limited role in driving forward high value-added production or helping in the innovation drive to close key tech gaps. One example, GSE Toyota, a Sino-Japanese JV internal combustion engine automaker, is covered in the case study below. The greater importance of ideology and geopolitical rivalry are nurturing a more repressive political economy which tends to be less responsive to a moderate society. 69 Under such a system, social and regional divisions are likely to become a major issue going forward. Though more policy changes attempting to address the resulting problems can be expected in the context of common prosperity, the overall prioritization of national strategic goals over economic growth seems to be a new hallmark of China's economic system. Chapter 6 China contends for the central position in the global economy. Throughout the reform process initiated under Deng Xiaoping, China's foreign economic policies remained highly restrictive and controlled, most notably, its strict capital controls and restrictions on foreign investments. The general mantra of hedged integration with the global economy has not changed under Xi Jinping. But the parameters for China's future opening are increasingly happening on its own terms. In the process, China is reinforcing and strengthening controls over international trade and finance, in and outbound investment and the flow of data and people that make up Fortress China. It is also a reminder that the relative trade openness that has been a key driver for China's integration over the past decades is more the exception than the norm for China. Global economic integration should now be on China's terms to safeguard its national interests and long-term economic development. The objective is to create economic and technological dependencies by developing new markets, controlling value chains and securing access to key resources for China's industry, energy, and food needs. Instead of pursuing Western-style globalization driven by capitalism, China is seeking its own path consistent with greater party control and guidance. A world in which companies act independently from national strategic goals in pursuit of profitability conflicts with Xi Jinping's economic principles. National interest should take precedence over profit-driven motivations. Beijing recognizes the need for China to remain connected to the global economy to advance its development and expand global power, but is wary of unfettered, Western-style globalization. However, China is not on a path towards isolation. It is not in China's interest to completely disconnect with liberal market economies, as it still needs their markets for exports and needs its capital and technology to overcome existing tech dependencies. Providing economic incentives is also an effective tool to keep countries in line with China's interests and positions. To facilitate this, China is highly active in deepening ties with the global south as it seeks to develop new alternatives. 3 key features of China's engagement with the world are challenging the existing global economic order, mitigating risks with liberal market economies, and engaging with emerging and developing countries. Challenging the global order, the leadership's efforts to strengthen China's position as a global economic power lacks neither vision nor ambition. China is doubling down in its effort to pull more and more countries and companies into its sphere of economic influence. The BRI has helped China expand its trade faster and served as a new source of external demand. Investment-driven engagement has focused on building hardware, complemented by agreements to provide the software to run it. U.S. economic sanctions and concerns that American global hegemony is waning have provided China additional inroads and growing economic clout. In response to geopolitical shifts, China has accelerated its efforts by rolling out numerous new initiatives. In 2022, it launched the Trinity of the Global Development Initiative, GDI, the Global Security Instigative, GSI, and the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI. Older formats such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization formed in 2001 seem to have gained new momentum. Shifting the economic center of gravity, ideally, China should provide an alternative if not replace the dominance of liberal market economies as a global provider of technology and capital. While expanding economic ties with liberal market economies was a catalyst for China's development in the past, China is now seeking greater engagement with the global south, promoting development in these new markets to cultivate new customers for its exports. It portrays itself as the champion of the global south, which frustrated with the American-led world order that leverages the gravitational pull of its economy. In a shifting global context, China's multifaceted set of policies are finding welcome takers around the world. Develop China's own de-risking strategy. Just as voices in advanced economies say there is no second China as a market, the reality is that there is no second set of liberal market economies for China when it comes to technology, capital, and demand for Chinese exports. While it aims for autarky, China is not in a position to cut all foreign dependencies without massive implications for its own development. One way is by absorbing global value chains through greater localization of foreign companies. China has opened up many sectors to foreign investment to onshore key technology providers. Ironically, opening up in such areas advances technological self-reliance by bringing foreign technology under Beijing's jurisdiction. The globalization that has driven China's engagement with the world is undergoing a structural break, with new risks and opportunities for China to shape its own position. To understand the direction China is taking in its relationship with the rest of the world, it is critical to examine its changing patterns of trade, investment, technology, and finance. 2 case studies at the end of this chapter cover how an emerging global tech leader in the EV space, BYD, as well as the old state-owned national shipping champion, COSCO, contribute to the strategic goals of Beijing at home, but especially overseas. Title 1 Trade. China wants to develop new export markets and increase dependencies on the Chinese market. Growing trade ties have long been the key driver for China's global integration. China overtook the U.S. as the biggest trade partner of 71% of the world in 2021. Gaining access to the large Chinese market is an irresistible lure to deepen ties with China, including through new bilateral or regional trade agreements. After years of booming trade with advanced economies, export volumes are nearing saturation, but with 40% of China's exports going to the EU, US, and Japan in 2022, developing new export markets is still an uphill battle. Regional trade deals like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, are useful for Beijing to build regional supply chains and markets, especially in Southeast Asia where more geopolitically neutral countries in its immediate neighborhood are less likely to sign on to what China perceives as U.S. containment efforts. China is still heavily dependent on a few Western countries for high-tech, but also for key commodities, e.g., U.S. for soy or Australian iron ore and coal. While self-sufficiency is a feasible solution for reducing tech dependencies, diversification efforts facilitated by the BRI are a key for commodities that China lacks, e.g., Brazil for soy and iron ore. After all, no effort from Beijing will make iron ore spontaneously materialize within China's borders, see Exhibit 17. China is now focused on deepening ties with the global south. China's strategic engagement with emerging countries expanded its global economic footprint and helped to improve food security and access to raw materials, including ones critical for the energy transition. Starting December 1, 2022, China reduced trade restrictions on 9 African countries for over 8,000 items and the pursuit of trade deals in Latin America for market access and securing commodities. China has much to gain from providing better market access, especially for exports of commodities and lower-value products, while competition in higher-value goods with advanced economies will likely impact the trade structure. However, during a meeting of the Central Finance Committee in May 2023, it was stressed that China should not give up on low-end industry and instead transform it, as it provides an important foundation for manufacturing. China's trade structure will need to considerably change, becoming less export-driven and relying on more diversified import structures beyond commodities and high-tech. Growing trade is often accompanied with a growing trade deficit due to China's dominance in manufacturing. China has a trade deficit with only around 20 countries, all commodity exporters with the exception of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Switzerland. But the sheer size of the Chinese market remains the government's biggest driver for deepening economic ties. For emerging economies, it provides a welcome alternative to Western markets, while for advanced economies, deeper trade should act as a bridge over the growing political divide. See Exhibit 18. Title II Investment. China wants to become a key investor in emerging economies and attract high-tech investment. China has been a long-term recipient and beneficiary of foreign investment and continues to open access by trimming its negative list that restricts foreign investment in certain sectors and revising the catalog for sectors that encourage foreign investment. Slower growth prospects, geopolitical risks, and a more restrictive political environment has tarnished China's appeal for many foreign companies. Coupled with a weaker global economic outlook, foreign direct investment, FDI, in China fell to a 25-year low in the first half of 2023. FDI now more than ever is focused on helping close technological gaps and improve supply chain resilience. This means companies in high-tech sectors can expect red carpet treatment to onshore high-value-added production and R&D. The importance and concern of dwindling FDI has led the State Council to release a new set of measures aimed at attracting high-quality investment in August 2023. During the last decade, China has started to establish itself as a major investor overseas. Initially, Chinese investments were focused on developing countries. The BRI, launched in 2013, and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, AIIB, in 2015 were prominent efforts in Xi Jinping's ambition to strengthen China's position in the world. China does provide an attractive alternative for many developing countries, and one that does not tie investments to issues of human rights or environmental protection. Central elements of the BRI and the AIIB have been their emphasis on financing and infrastructure projects to meet their transportation, communication, and energy infrastructure demands in foreign countries. But there are also examples of dedicated development zones such as the Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone in Cambodia. Despite criticism of being a potential debt trap and pushback in some regions amid disappointment about delivering on pledged investments, the initiatives have yielded tangible results. China is seen as a partner for economic development for a wide range of projects from infrastructure to dealing with climate change. In developed countries, Chinese companies have also started to gain traction as an investor. In 2016, Chinese firms invested a record €47.5 billion in EU27 and the UK. However, investment has steadily slowed. In 2022, Chinese investment in Europe was only €7.9 billion, down 83% from the 2016 peak. The decline is caused by tightening capital restrictions in China to prevent investments in non-strategic areas such as football clubs or real estate, and political and regulatory pushback in the US and Europe that has made it more difficult for Chinese firms to conduct merger and acquisition (M&A) transactions, especially in critical infrastructure and technology assets. As in 2022, M&A fell to its lowest levels since 2011, €3.4 billion, record greenfield, €4.5 billion, has become new bright spot of Chinese investments in Europe, albeit fragile for now because this has targeted only a few sectors, primarily EV batteries. Despite China's surging outbound investment in the last decade, investment relations between liberal market economies, and China remain heavily uneven. While companies from those countries continue to invest heavily in China, the same is not true in the reverse. By 2021, European firms have invested an aggregated €233.6 billion in China, which is more than 3 times the amount that Chinese firms have invested in Europe, €69.9 billion. China's role as a global investor is likely to increase, but will be met with more competition as liberal market economies roll out new development projects in response to the BRI. The investment structure will need to shift more from infrastructure and M&A to greenfield investments, increasing the international exposure of Chinese companies. As of now, China's investment in manufacturing in ASEAN, for example, significantly lags those of the US, EU, or Japan. See Exhibit 19. Title 3 Technology. China wants to expand its footprint to become a global provider. China can still tap into global know-how via its overseas students or by acquiring crucial licenses. For example, the MCCI subindex on intellectual property rights, IPR, imports reached 0.52 in 2020, indicating a high level of integration. Access to foreign IPR is essential for China to continue to expand its industrial capabilities. But China has already evolved into a viable provider for technology, issuing IPR of its own, with strong growth since 2017. See Exhibit 20. Companies from Huawei to Xiaomi are household names in the area of consumer electronics. Chinese companies can provide a wide range of products from 5G networks to high-speed railway systems and energy solutions, including green tech. Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia in December 2022 was a demonstration of China's attractiveness as a development partner. The deal signed included commitments on developing hydrogen energy, data centers, and EV factories in Saudi Arabia. Digital companies have expanded their footprint as technology providers from artificial intelligence, e-commerce, and mobile payment applications to communication, smart cities, and surveillance equipment. In November 2022 alone, China completed e-commerce agreements with Laos, Thailand, Singapore, and Pakistan. See Exhibit 20. China's growing technological clout is a result of its improved innovation capacity. High-tech companies in liberal market economies now consider it essential to be part of the Chinese innovation ecosystem by expanding R&D capacity to safeguard their global competitiveness. It is an indispensable location for foreign companies, especially in dynamic sectors like digital applications, smart manufacturing, and electric/autonomous vehicles. China will leverage its growth potential and improved position in the high-tech sector to make it an irresistible market for high-tech companies. Maintaining access to technology remains vital for China's future ability to innovate. China is successfully engaging abroad to help create demand for Chinese technology. While its engagement in emerging countries is more focused on government-to-government relations, China is increasingly building on ties to companies in liberal market economies. In an attempt to tie them into China's innovation system, they hope to make international access to technology more resilient. Title 4 Finance. China wants to provide an alternative to the USD-dominated financial system. After years of promises and the opening of China's financial markets in theory, real capital flows are now materializing. Strict capital controls remain in place, but China has expanded existing channels and introduced new ones to connect, e.g., Hong Kong Stock Connect or the Shanghai London Stock Connect, its financial markets with the world. While in the past financial integration was mostly a one-way street with Chinese purchasing equities, including of Chinese companies listed abroad, and bonds, including U.S. treasuries, the picture is now becoming more balanced. The sophistication and complexity of China's financial system has greatly improved, creating an additional pull for foreign investors to participate. This includes issuing CNY-denominated bonds in China and expanding offshore financial markets. Existing capital account restrictions and growing political risks are likely to keep liberal market economies' investors underinvested in China relative to its share in the global economy. But gradual financial integration is likely to remain a key driver for China's global economic ties as it provides alternatives for advanced and emerging economies alike. China is also actively trying to break USD dominance in global trade settlement. New hope rests on the introduction of the eCNY, the box digital currency, as well as chips, the alternative to the current global payment system SWIFT. For Russia, this has provided a helpful alternative, as the Chinese currency was used for 17.9% of settlements in 2021, up from 3.1% in 2014. In 2023, agreements with Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Brazil aim to increase use of the CNY for trade with China, e.g., via swap agreements between the central banks. The CNY's internationalization will likely accelerate but with limitations, as this would require China to give up its strict capital account controls. The emphasis on infrastructure-driven investment has also turned China into a major loan provider, providing $450 billion in net lending as of 2020, see Exhibit 21. Consistent with its narrative of championing the global south, most of the lending has gone to developing countries. As a major lender, China can project more financial might, but it is also not risk-free. Debt defaults pose a substantial external risk to its financial system. Chapter 7: Beijing struggles to balance economy and ideology. Over the past decade, Xi Jinping was able to progressively expand his own vision for China's economic system by reconfiguring it with the ideological principles outlined in the previous chapters. In 2023, the economy is, again, under much stronger guidance of the party, and economic policymaking is beset by growing distrust of liberal market economies. The implementation of Xi Jinping's economic priorities are in full swing in pursuit of achieving the 2049 vision of the Great Rejuvenation. But clearly it is not all smooth sailing, and Xi Jinping's third term looks to be off to a rocky start. It is becoming inherently difficult to reconcile economic interests with political ones, and it is becoming obvious that pursuing geopolitical priorities comes with a price on the economy. The expectations of a swift return to pre-pandemic consumption patterns within Chinese households have been thwarted while private companies are struggling. It seems as if the leadership underestimated the profound impact of the confluence of factors from zero COVID, the crackdown on the dynamic tech sector and real estate, as well as rising geopolitical risks. As the economy is absorbing the policy medicine the party state prescribed, it is causing side effects for the different actors. Society, after decades of improvement in livelihood, the outlook is changing for some. There is a risk of parts of China's youth being part of the first generation since the start of the reform process that sees its development stall. Record levels of youth unemployment and poor wage prospects have resulted in growing disillusion. While growing nationalism might counter this to some extent, accepting hardship for the greater good of the nation will be a difficult sell for many. Bureaucracy, compared to the start of Xi Jinping's first term, party and government officials are operating in a very different ecosystem. The anti-corruption campaigns, the return of ideology, and increasingly top-down and campaign-style approach to policymaking have diminished the incentives for policymaking experimentation at the local level. Officials that must do their job while wearing their political hats will likely continue to decide that doing what is ideologically right is more important than what might actually work in their ecosystem, or worse yet, that they will choose inaction out of fear that the consequences of any steps they take will yield the wrong results. Chinese companies, many private companies, are at odds with the direction of economic policies, while without doubt some companies also flourish as they fully embrace the priorities. There is a real risk of many highly innovative and productive economic actors choosing to hold their heads down by not being willing to take on entrepreneurial risk if the prospects of returns are limited if they are not aligned with the strategic priorities of the party. Similarly, the many export-oriented SMEs that have thrived over the past decades serving liberal market economies might also be at odds with politics increasingly getting in the way of business. Foreign companies, lower growth prospects, and changing market environment are forcing foreign companies to make strategic adjustments on how they position themselves in the Chinese market. Many need to strike a balance between de-risking and localization in a way that does not undermine their competitive position. While China continues to court foreign companies, especially in technological areas it needs, companies are increasingly at risk of being caught up in opaque national security regulations or punished for actions of their home government. Title I recent economic policy adjustments do not mark a return to more liberal economic policies. In response to the struggling economy, the party released a range of policies aimed at alleviating concerns of private and foreign companies as well as households over the summer of 2023. They seem to be geared towards alleviating concerns over the direction of the economic system. Some of the most noticeable measures include, July 14, 2023, on the private sector, opinions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the State Council on promoting the development and growth of the private economy. 109 July 31, 2023, on consumption, the General Office of the State Council forwards the notice of the National Development and Reform Commission on measures to restore and expand consumption, August 13, 2023, on foreign investment, opinions of the State Council on further optimizing the foreign investment environment and enhancing the attraction of foreign investment, September 4, 2023, on the private sector, Private Economic Development Bureau by the National Reform and Development Commission, NDRC, is newly established. The policies embrace fair competition, market-oriented restructuring, stronger rule of law, efforts to boost consumption as well as more opportunities for foreign companies. Such measures are a recognition of how implementing Xi Jinping's the party's economic principles has affected sentiment of the private sector and households. The efforts to shore up economic growth revive more reformist language and contrast the efforts aimed at strengthening party oversight. However, the oft-billed pragmatism of such measures and language are not yet likely to be indicative of a sea change in Xi Jinping's approach to economic governance. Rather, these steps are matters of tone and timing. As the third plenum approaches, more such language can be expected for as long as China's economy continues to struggle. In an effort to improve business sentiment, the importance of markets and openness will be stressed. The aim is to soften the impact that economic actors are feeling as they settle into the new normal of Xi Jinping's geopolitically focused political economy. But akin to what was said in the 2013 third plenum, the words need to be seen in the larger context of Xi Jinping's visions for the country and the role the party has in it. The policy direction set during the third plenum will be a test and an opportunity to evaluate the attempt on how the leadership tries to reconcile trade-offs between strategic priorities and sufficient economic growth. At the moment, the adjustments are more symbolic than substantive. A meaningful shift of policy direction would likely demand far more economic and social pressure. Nevertheless, the recent measures to reinforce the private sector are reminders that the leadership is not immune to market sentiment and that the party struggles to sell its policy objectives to all its subjects. Success, of course, is not certain. There is the risk that the ideological streamlining of the economy fails, forcing for more substantial policy adjustments in the future. But for now, the overall direction is rigorously following the path Xi Jinping has set out over the past 10 years. Even in times of lower growth, it seems more likely that Xi Jinping will force his vision on economic actors and limit any adjustments to minor concessions. The events currently unfolding might be as impactful as China's integration into the world economy in the early 2000s. But the economic and geopolitical context has dramatically shifted from integration to competition, if not conflict, with liberal market economies. China's future reforms and opening must be seen in the context of Xi Jinping's strategy for its next stage of development. Instead of again engaging in wishful thinking about China's development path as was done in 2013, Europe and other liberal market economies will need to accept the systemic differences and work out a pathway for mutual existence that includes accepting the systemic challenge and preparing for competition. Dealing with China and the structural break of today's globalization should be seen as a wake-up call for Europe. It presents an opportunity and will require the courage to break through decades-old thinking. Policymakers in corporate boardrooms continue to take a defensive posture as they face the dilemma of responding to a changing China. European policy is focused on measures to defend the common market from distortions from and dependencies on China, while C-suite discussions are about how to defend their footprint in the China market. All actors would do well to adopt more offensive postures that coolly calculate what will be necessary to compete with China in third markets. For corporations, that means assertive strategies to secure market share in third markets and to wrestle with increasingly advanced competitors. For policymakers, that means strengthening ties with third countries and building the framework necessary to support European exports and investors in markets beyond Europe's jurisdiction. In other words, pursue in other markets the kind of strategies Europe applied to China after it began reform and opening up.